A Nazi officer accidentally saved thousands of Allied lives with a single typo. Tonight, you'll discover 3 hours of World War II's most unbelievable true stories that historians rarely discuss, each more shocking than fiction itself. The British had a problem during World War II. German coal supplies kept powering their war machine, and traditional bombing wasn't cutting it. Then, someone in the Special Operations Executive came up with the most ridiculous solution imaginable: dead rats stuffed with explosives. Yes, you heard that right. The plan was beautifully twisted in its simplicity. British agents would sneak these explosive-laden rat carcasses into German coal bunkers. When workers shoveled coal into boilers, they'd toss the rats in too, thinking they were just regular dead rodents that had gotten mixed in with the fuel. Once those rats hit the intense heat of the boiler fires, boom, the explosives would detonate, destroying the boilers and crippling German operations. The SOE operatives were proud of their creativity. They carefully hollowed out real rat bodies and packed them with plastic explosives. The weight felt authentic. The appearance looked convincing. Even the smell was appropriately revolting. These weren't your garden variety fake props. They were masterpieces of deception. But here's where things get interesting. The Germans discovered the first shipment of rat bombs before they could be used. A German worker spotted something suspicious about one of the rodents and called in the authorities. Within hours, Nazi officials realized they were dealing with an ingenious British sabotage attempt. Most military strategists would consider this a complete failure. The rats never exploded. No boilers were destroyed. Zero German infrastructure was damaged. The British had wasted time, resources, and effort on what appeared to be a spectacular flop. The Germans, however, had a very different reaction. They went absolutely paranoid. Every dead rat found near German facilities became a potential bomb. Workers couldn't just shovel coal anymore. They had to inspect every single piece for suspicious rodents. Military engineers were called in to examine rat carcasses with the same intensity they'd use for defusing actual bombs. Entire shifts were devoted to rat inspection duties. German efficiency, which had been one of their greatest military advantages, ground to a halt whenever dead animals appeared. Soldiers who should have been fighting were instead poking at rat corpses with long sticks. Engineers who could have been building defenses were dissecting rodent remains in makeshift laboratories. The paranoia spread like wildfire through German ranks. Officers issued detailed instructions on rat identification procedures. Training manuals included chapters on recognizing potentially explosive wildlife. Some facilities even hired specialists whose only job was examining dead animals for signs of tampering. What makes this even more absurd is that the British only sent one shipment of explosive rats, just one. But the Germans didn't know that. For months afterward, they treated every deceased rodent as a potential threat to national security. The psychological impact was devastating. German workers began avoiding areas where rats might be found. Coal handling procedures became incredibly slow and methodical. Productivity dropped significantly across multiple facilities, not because of actual sabotage, but because of the fear of sabotage that might never come. The British Special Operations Executive had stumbled onto something brilliant. They'd discovered that the threat of an attack could be just as disruptive as an actual attack. The Germans were essentially sabotaging themselves through their own paranoia and overcautious procedures. Intelligence reports from German-occupied territories described the chaos perfectly. Workers were spending more time examining rats than doing their actual jobs. Military resources were being diverted from frontline operations to deal with rodent inspection protocols. The German war machine was slowing down, one suspicious rat at a time. Then there's the psychological warfare aspect that the British hadn't even planned for. German morale took a hit when soldiers realized they were spending their days afraid of dead rats. It's hard to feel like a superior military force when you're terrified of rodent carcasses. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on the troops. The rat bomb plot became legendary within SOE circles, not because it worked as intended, but because it worked better than intended. The British had learned a valuable lesson about psychological warfare. Sometimes the fear of an unusual attack method is more effective than the attack itself. German counterintelligence eventually figured out that no more rat bombs were coming, but by then the damage was done. Weeks of productivity had been lost. Resources had been wasted on a threat that existed only in their imagination. The British had achieved more disruption with a handful of dead rats than many conventional bombing raids accomplished. The beauty of the operation lay in its perfect failure. The rats never exploded, but they didn't need to. German paranoia had done all the work for them. While the Nazis were busy examining rodent corpses, the British were planning their next unconventional surprise. And speaking of animals in warfare, the Soviets had their own four-legged weapons program that was far more tragic than clever. While the British were stuffing dead rats with explosives, the Soviet Union decided to turn man's best friend into a weapon of war. Dogs had always been loyal companions to soldiers, but nobody expected them to become living missiles against German tanks. The idea seemed brilliant on paper. Train dogs to run under enemy vehicles, strap explosives to their backs, and let them destroy German armor from below. What could go wrong? Well, quite a lot actually. Soviet military engineers started with timer-based bombs attached to specially trained dogs. The plan was simple enough: release the dogs near German tank formations, watch them scurry underneath the vehicles, then wait for the explosion. But dogs don't follow military schedules. Some wandered off to chase rabbits, others got distracted by interesting smells. A few just sat down and refused to move. The timing mechanism created another problem. Dogs don't understand countdowns. They'd run under a tank, then keep running. The explosion would happen in empty air while the confused dog trotted away, tail wagging. German tank crews probably thought they were being attacked by the world's luckiest puppies. Then there's the cruel reality nobody wants to discuss. These weren't remote-controlled robots. They were living animals who trusted their human handlers completely. The dogs had no idea they were carrying their own death sentences. They thought they were playing a game or doing a job, just like fetching sticks or guarding camps. Soviet engineers realized the timer system wasn't working. Their solution? Impact detonated explosives that would trigger the moment the dog crawled under a tank. This eliminated the timing problems but created a much darker situation. Now every successful mission guaranteed the dog's death. The training process reveals just how desperate the Eastern Front had become. Dogs were taught to associate the undersides of tanks with food. Trainers would place meals beneath parked Soviet tanks, conditioning the animals to seek shelter and sustenance in those dark mechanical spaces. The dogs learned this behavior so well that they'd instinctively run toward any tank they saw. But battlefield conditions differed drastically from training grounds. Real combat involved screaming engines, exploding shells, rifle fire, and chaos that no training exercise could replicate. Many dogs panicked when released into actual battle. Some ran back toward their handlers, carrying live explosives. Others froze in terror, becoming sitting targets for German soldiers who quickly figured out what was happening. German forces adapted faster than the Soviets expected. Tank crews started shooting any dog that approached their vehicles. Infantry units received orders to kill dogs on sight near the front lines. Some German soldiers felt terrible about this. Many of them were dog lovers themselves, but war creates impossible choices. The most tragic cases involved dogs who successfully completed their missions. These loyal animals crawled under enemy tanks exactly as trained, trusting that their human companions had given them an important job to do. The explosions that followed were powerful enough to disable or destroy German armor, but the cost was heartbreaking. Weather conditions on the Eastern Front made everything worse. Russian winters are brutal for humans, but imagine being a dog carrying metal explosives in sub-zero temperatures. Summer brought different challenges: mud, heat, and terrain that slowed the animals down, making them easier targets for German gunners. Soviet records from this period are incomplete, but historians estimate that hundreds of dogs died in these anti-tank missions. Some were killed by enemy fire before reaching their targets. Others were blown up by their own explosives. A few lucky ones were captured by German soldiers and kept as pets, probably saving their lives. The program did achieve some tactical success. German tank formations became more cautious when operating in areas where anti-tank dogs had been spotted. Crews wasted ammunition shooting at every animal they saw, including harmless strays just looking for food. The psychological impact was real. Imagine trying to focus on combat while constantly watching for explosive puppies. What makes this story particularly strange is how it reflects the desperate innovation of wartime. Both sides were throwing everything they could think of at each other, including ideas that seemed to come from science fiction novels. The Soviets weren't the only ones experimenting with animal warfare, but they took it further than most. The anti-tank dog program eventually faded away as more effective weapons became available. Rocket-propelled grenades and improved artillery made animal-based attacks unnecessary. Military planners realized that training soldiers to use better anti-tank weapons was more efficient than training dogs to commit suicide. The legacy of these missions is complicated. They represent both human ingenuity and the moral compromises that war demands. The dogs were undeniably brave, even if they didn't understand what bravery meant in this context. Speaking of unexpected battlefield partnerships, there's another animal story from World War II that ends much more happily. While Soviet dogs were dying under German tanks, a Syrian brown bear was about to become one of the most beloved soldiers in the Polish army. Dead rats with explosives were one thing, but Soviet dogs carrying bombs to German tanks, that was just the beginning of World War II's strangest partnerships. What happened next makes those previous stories look almost normal. Castle Itter sat high in the Austrian Alps like something from a fairy tale, but in May 1945, this medieval fortress held some of France's most important prisoners. Former Prime Ministers Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud were locked inside. Tennis champion Jean Barotra paced the stone corridors. General Maxime Weygand, who once commanded all French forces, stared out barred windows at the mountains. The SS had turned this ancient castle into a prison for VIPs. These weren't ordinary captives served, they were political prizes the Nazis wanted alive, at least for now. Then Germany started falling apart. Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, the war was ending, but nobody told the SS guards at Castle Itter. They had orders to execute all prisoners before Allied forces arrived. Makes sense from their twisted perspective, right? Can't let valuable hostages fall into enemy hands. The prisoners knew what was coming. Death was marching up that mountain road. But here's where things get absolutely wild. A Wehrmacht officer, named Major Joseph Gangl, was stationed nearby. Wehrmacht as the regular German army, not the fanatical SS. Gangl had spent years fighting Americans and British forces across Europe. He'd followed orders, fought battles, lost friends. Now he faced a choice that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Gangl secretly contacted the approaching American forces. The message was simple but shocking. A German officer wanted to switch sides. Not surrender, actually fight alongside American troops. Against his own countrymen. The Americans were baffled. Was this a trap? Some desperate Nazi trick? Lieutenant Jack Lee of the 12th Armored Division decided to take the risk. The prisoners' lives hung in the balance, and frankly they needed all the help they could get. What happened next was the only time in World War II that American and German soldiers fought side by side against a common enemy. Lee arrived at the castle with just 14 men and one Sherman tank. Gangl brought his small group of Wehrmacht soldiers. Together, they prepared to defend a medieval fortress against an SS assault force. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. The French prisoners weren't content to hide in their cells either. Former Prime Minister Reynaud grabbed a rifle. Tennis star Barotra volunteered for the most dangerous job, escaping over the castle walls to get help from Austrian resistance fighters in the valley below. Picture that, a world-famous athlete scaling ancient stone walls under enemy fire, racing through alpine forests to rally reinforcements. The SS attack began at dawn on May 5, 1945. Fanatical troops who had sworn allegiance to a dead Führer stormed the castle grounds. American GIs and Wehrmacht soldiers crouched behind the same stone walls, sharing ammunition and covering each other's positions. Major Gangl took a sniper's bullet through the head while fighting beside his former enemies. Less German officer died protecting French politicians from his own SS countrymen. The war had twisted everything into impossible shapes. But the strangest alliance held. American soldiers and German troops coordinated their fire. They called out warnings to each other in broken English and German. Former Prime Minister Daladier helped spot enemy positions from the tower windows. The battle raged for hours. The SS nearly broke through twice, but the mixed defenders drove them back. When reinforcements finally arrived, thanks partly to Barotra's desperate mountain run, the SS forces melted away into the forests. Castle Itter was free. The VIP prisoners survived. And for one brief, surreal moment in history, sworn enemies had become brothers in arms. The American and German soldiers shook hands in the castle courtyard. Some even exchanged addresses, promising to write after the war. Lee recommended several Wehrmacht troops for medals. The whole thing felt like something from an alternate universe. Yet, it really happened. Documentation exists. Photographs show American and German officers standing together, smiling awkwardly at the camera. The weirdest team-up in military history, worked exactly when it needed to. The war officially ended just 3 days later. Germany surrendered completely on May 8. Castle Itter became a footnote, one of the very last battles fought in Europe. But while Americans and Germans were learning to fight together in Austrian castles, the Japanese had been working on something completely different. They'd spent years perfecting a weapon that could cross entire oceans without pilots, fuel, or even engines. Their target, American forests thousands of miles away. While most countries dropped bombs from planes, Japan had a completely different idea. They decided to let the wind do the work. In late 1944, Japanese engineers launched the most ambitious long-distance attack in military history. They sent over 9,000 balloon bombs floating across the Pacific Ocean, hoping to burn down America's forests and terrorize the population. The concept sounds almost childish until you understand the engineering behind it. These weren't party balloons. Each balloon measured 33 feet across and was made from mulberry paper glued together by schoolchildren. The Japanese had discovered the jet stream, a river of fast-moving air high in the atmosphere that could carry objects from Asia to North America in just 3 days. But here's where it gets clever. The balloons carried an automatic altitude control system that would drop sandbags when the balloon flew too low and release hydrogen gas when it flew too high. After crossing the ocean, a timer would drop incendiary bombs designed to start massive forest fires across Oregon, Washington, and California. The Japanese called it Operation Fugo. They believed these fires would force America to pull firefighters and resources away from the war effort. Even better, the random nature of the attacks would create panic among civilians who had no idea where the next balloon might land. Launch sites along Japan's eastern coast began releasing balloons in November 1944. The timing seemed perfect. Winter winds were strongest, and American forests would be dry and ready to burn. Japanese meteorologists calculated wind patterns with remarkable precision, considering they were working with 1940s technology. The balloons traveled an incredible journey. They rose to 30,000 feet, higher than most military aircraft could fly at the time. The jet stream grabbed them and hurled them eastward at speeds reaching 200 miles per hour. Most balloons that survived the trip arrived in just 72 hours, having traveled over 5,000 miles. American officials were baffled when the first balloons started appearing. A Navy patrol spotted one floating off the California coast in November 1944. Then a rancher in Montana found strange debris in his field. Military investigators quickly realized these weren't weather balloons gone astray. The government faced a dilemma. Should they warn the public about mysterious weapons falling from the sky? Instead, they chose total secrecy. Newspapers agreed to a voluntary blackout on balloon stories. The plan worked so well that most Americans never knew about the attacks until after the war ended. Meanwhile, balloons kept arriving. They landed in places you'd never expect. One crashed near a nuclear facility in Washington state. Another landed in Wyoming, and a curious sheriff decided to cut the suspension cables. The bomb exploded, but he survived with only minor injuries. The forest fire plan had one major flaw. Japanese intelligence was terrible. They assumed American forests would be bone dry in winter, perfect kindling for their incendiary bombs. Instead, the Pacific Northwest was experiencing one of its wettest winters on record. The forests were absolutely soaked. Balloon after balloon landed in soggy woods that refused to catch fire. Rain and snow had turned the intended targets into giant wet sponges. The few fires that did start were quickly extinguished by natural moisture or alert forest rangers. Then there's the tragic exception. On May 5, 1945, a Sunday school group was having a picnic in Oregon when they discovered a balloon bomb. The minister's wife and 5 children were killed when it exploded. They became the only mainland American civilians killed by enemy action during World War II. The attack created an interesting problem for American scientists. They had to figure out where these balloons were coming from using only the debris. Geologists analyzed sand from the sandbags and traced it to specific beaches in Japan. This detective work helped the military locate and bomb the balloon launch sites. Of the 9,000 balloons launched, only about 300 ever reached North America. Most fell into the Pacific Ocean or exploded at high altitude. The ones that did arrive spread across an enormous area, from Alaska to Mexico, and as far east as Michigan. The Japanese abandoned the program in April 1945. They had no way to know if their balloons were causing any damage because of the American media blackout. Without feedback, they assumed the campaign was failing and shifted resources to defending their home islands. American military officials learned something important about information warfare. Sometimes the best defense against terror weapons isn't better technology or more firepower. Sometimes it's simply keeping quiet and refusing to let the enemy know they're succeeding in causing fear. But Japan's creative approach to long-distance warfare wasn't their only unconventional military strategy. Their underwater forces were developing equally surprising tactics, using tiny submarines for missions that seemed impossible. When Japanese intelligence intercepted American radio transmissions during World War II, they heard something that drove them absolutely crazy. The messages sounded like complete gibberish. Not coded English, not scrambled letters, but something entirely foreign that their best cryptographers couldn't crack no matter how hard they tried. What they were hearing was Navajo, and it was about to become one of the war's most devastating secret weapons. The idea started with Philip Johnston, a World War I veteran who'd grown up on a Navajo reservation. His father was a missionary, which meant Johnston spoke fluent Navajo alongside English. During the early days of America's involvement in World War II, he approached the Marine Corps with a wild suggestion: why not use Native American languages as unbreakable military codes? The Marines were skeptical at first. They'd tried similar experiments during the First World War with mixed results, but Johnston convinced them to give it a shot. In May 1942, they recruited 29 young Navajo men for a top-secret program that would change everything. Here's what made this brilliant. Most military codes rely on substituting letters or numbers for words. Break the pattern, and you crack the code. But the Navajo approach was completely different. They created an entirely new military vocabulary, using their native language, then added another layer of complexity that would have made even the smartest codebreaker weep. The system worked like this. First, they developed Navajo words for military terms that didn't exist in their language. A fighter plane became hummingbird. A battleship was whale. Bombs were eggs. America became our mother. Then, for added security, they created a phonetic alphabet where each English letter had multiple Navajo equivalents. The letter A could be represented by the Navajo words for antat, apple, or axe. This meant that even if someone figured out part of the system, they'd still be completely lost. It was like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces kept changing shape. But the real genius wasn't just the language barrier. These weren't just translators sitting safely behind desks. The Navajo code talkers went into combat zones, transmitting vital information while bullets flew over their heads. They coordinated artillery strikes, called in air support, and relayed troop movements across some of the Pacific's bloodiest battlefields. During the Battle of Iwo Jima, 6 code talkers worked around the clock for the first 2 days of fighting. They sent over 800 messages without a single error. Think about that pressure. One mistake in translation could send artillery fire onto your own troops instead of the enemy. These men were literally holding lives in their voices. The Japanese threw everything they had at breaking these transmissions. They captured Native American soldiers from other tribes, hoping they might understand Navajo. They didn't. Navajo is incredibly complex, with tonal elements and grammatical structures unlike most other languages. Without growing up speaking it, you're basically hopeless. Japanese intelligence officers went nearly insane trying to crack what they assumed was some sort of super sophisticated American code machine. They never suspected that the machine was actually a group of young men from Arizona and New Mexico speaking their grandmother's language. The program expanded beyond just the Navajo. Choctaw, Cherokee, Comanche, and other tribes joined the effort. Each language brought its own advantages. The Choctaw had actually been used successfully in World War I, so they knew the drill. The Cherokee brought speakers who could also handle complex technical terminology. What's remarkable is how quickly these men could work. A typical military code machine took 30 minutes to encode, transmit, and decode a 3-line message. Code talkers could do the same job in 20 seconds. When you're calling in emergency artillery support with enemy forces charging your position, those 29 minutes and 40 seconds matter more than you can imagine. The secrecy around their work was absolute. Fellow Marines knew something special was happening, but they had no idea what. Some code talkers were assigned bodyguards, not to protect them from the enemy, but to protect them from confused American soldiers who might mistake their rapid Navajo conversations for enemy chatter. After major battles, Japanese prisoners would be interrogated about American communication methods. They consistently reported that the Americans had developed an unbreakable code system. They were right, just not in the way they thought. The program remained classified for decades after the war ended. Many code talkers returned home without being able to tell their families what they'd done during their service. They'd helped win the Pacific War, but they had to keep quiet about exactly how. While Native Americans were using ancient languages to confuse the enemy, Soviet women were taking to the skies in a completely different kind of secret warfare that would earn them a terrifying nickname from German soldiers. Soviet women pilots flew wooden biplanes into history during World War II. These weren't your typical fighter jets screaming through the sky at supersonic speeds. The Polikarpov Po-2 was basically a training aircraft held together with fabric, wood and hope. Maximum speed, about 94 miles per hour. That's slower than most cars on a highway today. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment formed in October 1941. Marina Raskova, already famous as a Soviet aviator, convinced Stalin to let women fly combat missions, not just as support crew or nurses, but as actual pilots dropping bombs on German positions. Stalin agreed, probably thinking it was a decent propaganda move. He had no idea these women would become Germany's worst nightmare. Here's where things get interesting. The Po-2 planes were so primitive they actually became advantages in night combat. German radar couldn't detect them properly because they flew too low and too slow. The wooden construction meant they barely showed up on detection equipment. These planes were invisible ghosts drifting through the darkness. Each mission involved flying behind enemy lines with nothing but a compass and basic maps. No radio communication. No parachutes most of the time because the planes couldn't carry the extra weight. The women navigated by following rivers, roads and railway lines in complete darkness. One wrong turn meant death or capture. The bombing technique was pure genius and absolutely terrifying. Pilots would fly in formations of 3 planes. The first 2 would approach the target with engines running, drawing German searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. While German gunners focused on those decoy planes, the third pilot would cut her engine and glide silently toward the target. The only sound was wind whistling through the wing struts. Germans described it as a witch's broomstick swooping through the night. That's exactly what they called these women. Nachhexen, night witches. The name was supposed to be an insult, but the Soviet pilots wore it like a badge of honor. German soldiers genuinely feared these silent attacks more than massive bombing raids by Allied forces. At least with big bombers you could hear them coming. The psychological warfare was incredible. German troops never knew when death would drop from the sky without warning. Soldiers couldn't sleep properly. Every tiny sound in the darkness could be another night witch preparing to strike. The constant fear wore down German morale across the entire Eastern Front. Let's talk numbers that will blow your mind. Between 1942 and 1945, these women flew over 30,000 combat missions. 30,000. Some pilots completed 8 missions in a single night, landing only to refuel and reload bombs before taking off again. They flew in all weather conditions, rain, snow, fog that would ground modern aircraft. The planes carried only 2 small bombs per mission. Doesn't sound like much, right? Well, imagine 30,000 precision strikes hitting ammunition dumps, supply convoys, communication centers and troop positions. Each bomb was placed exactly where it would cause maximum damage. No carpet bombing, no wasted explosives. Pure surgical precision delivered by women who'd been flying for less than a year. Nadezhda Popova flew 852 combat missions and survived the entire war. Her plane was shot up so many times that mechanics joked about using more patches than original fabric. Once she landed with 42 bullet holes in her aircraft. Another time, German fighters caught her during daylight and shot her plane to pieces. But she still made it back to base. The casualty rate was brutal. 32 night witches died during the war. These weren't anonymous statistics. They were young women, many still teenagers, who'd volunteered to fly suicide missions night after night. Some were shot down by German fighters. Others crashed in bad weather or mechanical failures. A few were captured and executed. But here's what the Germans never understood. Every time they killed a night witch, 10 more women wanted to join the regiment. Word spread throughout the Soviet Union about these female pilots terrorizing the mighty Wehrmacht. Women lined up to volunteer for what was essentially a 3-year death sentence. The night witches received some of the highest decorations in Soviet military history. 23 women earned the Hero of the Soviet Union medal, equivalent to America's Medal of Honor. They proved that courage and skill mattered more than gender or aircraft technology. Their wooden biplanes might have been ancient, but the tactics were revolutionary. Modern military forces still study night witch techniques for low-altitude stealth missions. The combination of psychological warfare and precision bombing created a template that special forces use today. The war ended in May 1945, and suddenly these combat veterans found themselves expected to return to traditional women's roles. Many struggled with civilian life after years of nightly combat missions. Their contributions were largely forgotten during the Cold War, buried under Soviet secrecy and Western ignorance. Of course, not every brilliant wartime scheme worked out as planned. Sometimes the most carefully designed military equipment could backfire spectacularly, turning victory into disaster with something as simple as a bathroom mistake. You'd think the biggest threats to a submarine would be depth charges, torpedoes, or enemy destroyers. But what about a toilet? Well, Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt of U-1206 learned the hard way that sometimes your worst enemy isn't above the water, it's in the bathroom. German U-boats were technological marvels, packed with advanced equipment and deadly weapons. These submarines could stay underwater for weeks, hunting Allied ships across the Atlantic. But there was one piece of equipment that caused more problems than anyone expected: the toilet system. German submarines used a complicated high-pressure toilet system that required specific training to operate safely. The procedure was so complex that only specially trained crew members were supposed to handle it. Think of it like a dangerous machine disguised as a bathroom fixture. One wrong move could flood the entire submarine. Captain Schlitt thought he could figure it out himself. After all, how hard could using a toilet be? He was wrong, dead wrong. On April 14, 1945, U-1206 was cruising off the coast of Scotland when nature called. Instead of asking for help from the trained toilet operator, Schlitt decided to handle the situation personally. He opened the wrong valves in the wrong sequence. Seawater immediately began rushing into the submarine. The flooding was bad enough, but it got worse. Much worse. The seawater poured directly into the battery compartment below the toilet. When salt water hits submarine batteries, it creates chlorine gas, a deadly poison that can kill everyone on board within minutes. The crew had two choices: stay underwater and die from poison gas, or surface and face the British Navy. Schlitt ordered an emergency surface. The submarine shot up from the depths like a cork, breaking through the waves in broad daylight. Every crew member knew they were sitting ducks. British patrol planes and ships constantly hunted German U-boats in these waters. Within minutes, a British patrol aircraft spotted the surfaced submarine. The pilot immediately called for backup and began his attack run. U-1206 was helpless, too damaged to dive, too slow to escape. The British planes dropped depth charges and strafed the submarine with machine gun fire. The crew abandoned ship as quickly as possible. Some jumped into the freezing North Sea waters, while others climbed into life rafts. One sailor drowned during the chaotic evacuation, and 3 others were missing and presumed dead. The rest were picked up by British ships and spent the remainder of the war as prisoners. Captain Schlitt survived the ordeal, but his submarine career was over. U-1206 sank to the bottom of the sea, another casualty of the Battle of the Atlantic. The official German Navy records listed the cause as toilet malfunction. But here's the truly bizarre part: U-1206 wasn't just any submarine. It was one of Germany's newest and most advanced U-boats, equipped with the latest technology and weapons. The submarine had successfully completed several combat patrols and sunk enemy ships. Its crew was experienced and well-trained. Yet all of that meant nothing when faced with a faulty toilet. The high-pressure toilet systems on German submarines were notorious among U-boat crews. Sailors joked nervously about the death toilets that could kill you faster than enemy fire. The systems were so complicated that many crew members simply held it rather than risk using the bathroom incorrectly. German submarine commanders received detailed training on every aspect of their vessels: navigation, weapons, engines, and diving procedures. But apparently, toilet operation wasn't covered thoroughly enough in submarine school. The incident with U-1206 became a cautionary tale throughout the German Navy. The timing made the disaster even more embarrassing. By April 1945, Germany was losing the war badly. U-boats were desperately needed to disrupt Allied supply lines and buy time for the crumbling German forces. Every submarine lost meant fewer options for the German Navy. Losing one to a bathroom accident was particularly humiliating. Allied intelligence officers couldn't believe the reports when they interrogated the captured crew. They suspected the Germans were lying to hide the real reason their submarine was destroyed. Surely no military vessel could be sunk by its own toilet system. But the crew's story never changed, and physical evidence from the wreck eventually confirmed the bizarre truth. The story of U-1206 spread quickly through both the German and Allied navies. For German sailors, it was a reminder of how dangerous life aboard a U-boat could be, even during routine activities. For Allied forces, it was proof that sometimes the enemy's worst enemy was themselves. This wasn't the only time mechanical failures caused submarine disasters, but it was certainly the most embarrassing. Other U-boats were lost to engine problems, electrical fires or structural failures, but having your submarine destroyed by a toilet malfunction was in a category all by itself. While Captain Schlitt's crew was learning hard lessons about bathroom safety, Ukrainian soccer players were facing their own life or death situation on a football field in Nazi-occupied Kiev. Football and war don't usually mix well, but in Nazi-occupied Kiev during the summer of 1942, they created one of the most tragic and heroic stories ever told. What happened on those makeshift pitches would cost lives, but it also showed the world something powerful about the human spirit. The German army had rolled into Ukraine like a crushing wave. Kiev fell in September 1941, and with it came the brutal reality of occupation. Soviet institutions crumbled overnight. The Red Army retreated or surrendered. Ordinary people faced a terrible choice: collaborate, resist, or try to survive somewhere in between. Among those caught in this nightmare were several professional footballers from FC Start, a team hastily formed from the remnants of Kiev's dissolved clubs. These weren't just any players. Many had starred for Dynamo Kiev before the war, representing the Soviet Union on international stages. Now they worked in a German-run bakery, using their athletic skills to knead bread instead of weaving through defenders. Football became their escape. Germans, being Germans, loved their organized sports. They saw recreational matches as a way to keep the local population distracted and relatively content. Ukrainian teams could play as long as they knew their place. The first few matches went exactly as expected. FC Start faced German military teams and local collaborators, winning some games and losing others. Nothing too dramatic. The Germans probably enjoyed watching these former Soviet stars struggle against well-fed Wehrmacht soldiers. But then came August 9, 1942. FC Start faced Flakelf, a team of German anti-aircraft gunners who had been dominating local competition. These weren't weekend warriors. They were fit, well-nourished soldiers representing the supposed master race, the Ukrainians. They were surviving on scraps, weakened by months of occupation and malnutrition. The match started predictably enough, but as the game progressed, something extraordinary happened. The Ukrainian players began to dominate. Their skill, honed through years of professional competition, overcame their physical disadvantages. They moved the ball with precision that left the Germans scrambling. By the final whistle, FC Start had won 5 months. The German spectators sat in stunned silence. Their invincible soldiers had been humiliated by a bunch of hungry bakers. Word of the defeat spread quickly through Nazi command. This wasn't just a football match anymore. It had become a symbol. German officers demanded a rematch, not requested, demanded. They made it crystal clear what they expected to happen. The Ukrainian players understood the message perfectly: lose or face consequences that went far beyond sport. August 13th arrived with an atmosphere thick as summer heat. Rumors swirled through the crowd about what the Germans had told FC Start. Some spectators came hoping to see their local heroes triumph again. Others feared what might happen if they did. Before kickoff, a German officer approached the Ukrainian changing room. His message was simple and direct: give the Nazi salute before the match, and make sure you lose. The players listened in silence. When he left, they had a choice to make. They walked onto the pitch and raised their arms. But instead of the Nazi salute, they shouted, "Physical culture," the traditional Soviet sports greeting. The crowd erupted. The Germans fumed. What followed was even more defiant than their words. FC Start didn't just refuse to lose. They played brilliantly. They scored goals with an almost casual elegance, as if they were enjoying a Sunday kickabout rather than risking their lives. At halftime, they led 3-0. The German team tried everything. Rough tackles that would have earned red cards in any civilized match. The referee, clearly under pressure, ignored obvious fouls against the Ukrainians. None of it mattered. FC Start kept scoring. The final score read 5-3. Another Ukrainian victory, even more stunning than the first. The crowd went wild, celebrating not just a football match, but a moment of pure resistance against their oppressors. Several FC Start players paid for their defiance with their lives. Within days, the Gestapo began making arrests. Some players were tortured and executed. Others disappeared into the Nazi prison system, never to return. The beautiful game had extracted its most terrible price. The match became known as the death match, though historians still debate exactly how many players died and when. What's certain is that these men chose sporting integrity over personal safety. They knew the risks. They played anyway. Their story spread far beyond Kiev. inspiring resistance movements across occupied Europe. Sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't guns or bombs, they're moments when ordinary people refuse to surrender their dignity. Speaking of unexpected resistance, imagine trying to capture an impenetrable fortress with just 80 men and some gliders. Some soldiers fought to death's door with nothing more than raw courage. Others had massive armies, powerful tanks and endless ammunition. But what if 80 men could capture 600 defenders using little more than silence and surprise? The Germans proved this possible at Fort Eben-Emael, and their success changed warfare forever. Belgium's Fort Eben-Emael stood like a concrete monster guarding the Albert Canal. Military experts called it absolutely impregnable. The fortress controlled key bridges between Belgium and the Netherlands, making it essential for any German advance westward. Thick concrete walls, underground tunnels, and powerful artillery made direct assault seem impossible. Traditional tactics demanded months of siege warfare or massive artillery bombardment. The fort's designers had thought of everything. Well, almost everything. German engineers studied aerial photographs for months, measuring every gun emplacement and entrance. They noticed something crucial: the fortress was designed to repel ground attacks from every direction. But nobody had considered an attack from directly above. The massive concrete roof, built to withstand artillery shells, wasn't designed for close combat fighting. Training began in absolute secrecy at a remote location in Germany. Soldiers practiced landing gliders on a full-scale replica of the fortress. These weren't ordinary paratroopers dropping from high altitude. Gliders could land silently, without the noise of aircraft engines alerting defenders. Each man learned the exact layout by heart, knowing which tunnels led where and which gun positions to neutralize first. But here's the weird part: they trained with brand new weapons nobody had seen before. Shaped charges, small explosive devices designed to punch through thick concrete, became their primary tools. These weren't massive bombs that would destroy everything. Instead, they focused explosive force into concentrated beams that could slice through fortress walls like hot knives through butter. Each soldier carried multiple charges, knowing exactly where to place them for maximum damage. May 10, 1940 arrived with perfect weather conditions. German gliders released from their tow planes high above Belgian territory, then descended silently through pre-dawn darkness. Fortress guards noticed nothing unusual: no aircraft engines, no artillery bombardment, no advancing troops, just another quiet morning at an impregnable fortress. The first glider touched down directly on the fortress roof at 5:30 a.m., then another, and another. Within minutes, 80 German soldiers had landed on top of what Belgium considered its strongest defensive position. Fortress defenders inside had no idea enemies were literally dancing on their roof. The Germans moved quickly, placing shaped charges on gun emplacements and ventilation shafts. Small explosions began echoing through the fortress corridors, but defenders couldn't understand where the attacks were coming from. Panic spread faster than wildfire through the underground tunnels. Belgian soldiers found their main guns destroyed before they could fire a single shot. Communication lines were severed, ventilation systems failed, making breathing difficult in the deep underground chambers. The Germans had turned the fortress's strongest feature, its thick protective roof, into their biggest advantage. What happened next defied every military manual written up to that point. Fort commanders realized their supposedly impregnable position had become a death trap. Artillery designed to destroy attacking armies couldn't be turned inward to fight enemies already inside. Thick walls that protected against external bombardment now prevented escape or reinforcement. The fortress had become a concrete prison for its own defenders. German forces used their shaped charges methodically, sealing tunnel entrances and destroying key defensive positions one by one. Belgian defenders trained for conventional siege warfare had no tactics for fighting enemies who had appeared magically on their roof. Radio calls for help went unanswered because nearby units couldn't believe the reports. By afternoon, over 600 Belgian defenders surrendered to 80 German attackers. The psychological impact proved even more devastating than the military victory. If Fort Eben-Emael could fall in hours, what defensive position was truly safe? The successful glider assault shattered confidence in fixed fortifications across Europe. Military planners worldwide began reconsidering their defensive strategies, realizing that vertical attacks could bypass even the strongest ground defenses. News of the fortress capture spread terror through Allied ranks. French military leaders had built their entire strategy around defensive lines and strong fortifications. If Germans could drop from the sky and capture any fortress within hours, how could France defend itself? This single operation helped convince French commanders that resistance was hopeless, contributing to France's rapid collapse weeks later. The German success at Épinay proved that unconventional thinking could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Sometimes the most obvious approach, attacking a fortress from the ground, isn't the smartest approach. Innovation beats brute force when clever minds find unexpected solutions to old problems. Speaking of unexpected solutions, Polish soldiers discovered that sometimes the best military ally doesn't march on two legs. Their unusual recruit would prove that courage comes in all shapes and sizes, especially when that recruit happens to weigh several hundred pounds and loves drinking beer with the troops. Most armies march on their stomachs, but the Polish army in World War II had a soldier who literally ate everything in sight. His name was Wojtek, and he happened to be a 6-foot-tall, 485-pound Syrian brown bear with an appetite for beer, cigarettes and ammunition boxes. The story begins in 1942 when a group of Polish soldiers discovered an orphaned bear cub in Iran. A local boy had found the tiny creature after hunters killed its mother. The Poles, recently released from Soviet labor camps and forming the Anders Army, bought the cub for some chocolate and a can of beef. They named him Wojtek, which means happy warrior in Polish. At first, Wojtek was just a mascot. The soldiers fed him condensed milk from an old vodka bottle. He slept in their tents, played with the men, and quickly became the regiment's beloved pet. But this wasn't your typical military mascot story. As Wojtek grew bigger, so did his responsibilities. The bear learned to salute when greeted by officers. He could open and close vehicle doors. Most impressively, he discovered he had a talent for carrying heavy objects. The soldiers noticed Wojtek could lift artillery shells that normally required 2 men to move. Then came the Battle of Monte Cassino in 1944, one of the bloodiest fights on the Italian front. The Polish forces were tasked with taking this heavily fortified German position that had already defeated multiple Allied attacks. During the intense bombardment, something extraordinary happened. Wojtek began carrying 100-pound artillery shells and boxes of ammunition to the gun positions. He walked upright on his hind legs, cradling the heavy shells in his arms like a furry, 4-legged supply truck. The sight was so remarkable that other Allied soldiers couldn't believe their eyes. Here was a bear, calmly walking through exploding shells and gunfire, delivering ammunition to Polish artillery crews. The bear's work ethic was legendary. While human soldiers needed breaks, Wojtek kept going. He never dropped a shell or showed fear during the bombardment. His contribution was so valuable that the Polish 22nd Artillery Supply Company adopted an image of a bear carrying an artillery shell as their official emblem. But Wojtek's military career required some creative paperwork. When the Polish forces were being shipped from the Middle East to Italy, British transport officers refused to allow a pet on board. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity. The Polish army officially enlisted Wojtek as a soldier, complete with his own paybook, rank, and serial number. Private Wojtek was now legitimate military personnel. The bear's daily routine would make most soldiers jealous. He woke up whenever he felt like it, usually around noon. Breakfast consisted of fruit, honey, and whatever the cook could spare. Wojtek had developed quite sophisticated tastes, preferring marmalade over regular jam and showing a particular fondness for beer. He would drink it straight from the bottle, just like his human comrades. His afternoon entertainment involved wrestling matches with the soldiers. Wojtek was gentle despite his massive size, understanding that his human friends were much smaller and weaker. He would pin them down softly, then release them when they tapped out. The bear also enjoyed practical jokes, like sneaking up behind unsuspecting soldiers and giving them a surprise hug. After the war ended, Wojtek faced the same displacement as many Polish soldiers. The communist government in Poland didn't want veterans of the Western Allied forces returning home. The bear, now a symbol of the Free Polish Forces, was equally unwelcome. In 1947, Wojtek retired to Edinburgh Zoo in Scotland. The transition was difficult for a bear accustomed to military life and constant human companionship. His former soldier friends would visit regularly, and Wojtek would become visibly excited, standing on his hind legs and saluting just like the old days. Visitors who spoke Polish could get special attention from the veteran bear. Wojtek lived at Edinburgh Zoo until 1963, becoming one of their most popular attractions. Children loved watching the bear who had helped win a war. Local Polish communities adopted him as their unofficial mascot, ensuring he received proper care and attention throughout his retirement. The bear's legacy extends beyond his military service. Wojtek represents the deep bonds formed during wartime and the lengths people will go to care for those they consider family. His story has inspired books, documentaries and monuments in multiple countries. While WW2 was making history on the Italian front, other armies were developing their own unconventional troops. The Allies had discovered that sometimes the most unexpected soldiers could provide the most valuable services, especially when they had 4 legs and specialized training. While WW2 the bear was carrying ammunition up mountains, the Allied forces had another 4-legged problem to solve. How do you get dogs behind enemy lines without them getting shot before they reach their target? The answer sounds like something from a cartoon, but it actually happened. Dogs with parachutes. The British started experimenting with canine paratroopers in 1943. These weren't your average house pets. Military trainers selected dogs based on specific criteria: calm temperament, intelligence, and the ability to stay quiet under pressure. German Shepherds and mixed breeds dominated the program because they could handle stress better than most purebreds. Training began with simple jumps from low platforms. Dogs wore specially designed harnesses that distributed weight evenly across their bodies. The parachutes were smaller versions of human chutes, but with one crucial difference. The dogs couldn't pull their own ripcords. Instead, the parachutes deployed automatically using static lines connected to the aircraft. When the dog jumped, the line would yank the chute open within seconds. The dogs had no control over their descent, which meant they needed to trust their human handlers completely. But here's where things get interesting. The dogs didn't jump alone. Each canine paratrooper was strapped to a specially trained soldier during the initial drops. This tandem system kept the animals calm and ensured they landed in the right spot. Later in the war, some dogs made solo jumps, but only after months of preparation. What did these airborne dogs actually do once they hit the ground? Their missions varied wildly. Some carried messages between isolated units when radio communication failed. Others were trained to detect mines and booby traps in recently captured territory. The most valuable dogs served as scouts, using their superior hearing and smell to warn soldiers about enemy positions. One remarkable mission involved a German Shepherd named Bing, who parachuted into Nazi-occupied France with British commandos. Bing's job was to locate wounded Allied soldiers who might be hiding in the countryside after failed missions. The dog successfully found 3 injured men over 2 weeks, and guided rescue teams to their locations. Then there were the messenger dogs who carried vital intelligence across enemy lines. These animals wore special waterproof pouches containing maps, photographs, and coded messages. If captured, the dogs were trained to return to their handlers rather than approach strangers. Some dogs made multiple jumps during their service, becoming veteran paratroopers in their own right. The training process took months and wasn't always successful. Many dogs simply couldn't handle the stress of jumping from aircraft. Others panicked during descent and injured themselves upon landing. Military records show that roughly 30% of dogs in the program washed out before completing training. Those who made it through faced real dangers in combat zones. German forces knew about Allied animal units and actively hunted for military dogs. Several canine paratroopers were killed by enemy fire shortly after landing. Others went missing in action and never returned to their units. Despite the risks, some dogs became genuine war heroes. A mixed breed named Rex received the Dickin Medal, often called the Animal Victoria Cross, for outstanding bravery during operations in Italy. Rex made 7 parachute drops and saved dozens of lives by detecting hidden explosives. The weird part is how these dogs adapted to military life. Many formed intense bonds with their handlers and showed signs of genuine excitement before missions. Some dogs even learned to recognize the sound of aircraft engines and would become agitated when they heard planes overhead, apparently eager to jump. Not all canine missions went according to plan. One dog named Charlie landed in a German vegetable garden and spent 3 days eating cabbage before friendly forces found him. Another dog, Sergeant Stubby II, got tangled in tree branches during a night drop and hung suspended for hours until dawn rescue. The program expanded beyond Europe. In the Pacific Theater, dogs parachuted onto remote islands to help establish communication networks. These missions were particularly dangerous because the terrain was unfamiliar and rescue was nearly impossible if something went wrong. American forces developed their own version of the program, focusing on search and rescue operations. These dogs were trained to locate downed pilots in dense jungle environments where human search teams might take days to find survivors. After the war ended, many paratrooper dogs struggled with civilian life. Some continued showing stress responses to aircraft noise for years. Others maintained their military training and had difficulty adjusting to peaceful environments. The legacy of these canine paratroopers influenced modern military animal programs. Today's military working dogs still use some techniques developed during World War II, though parachuting has largely been replaced by helicopter insertion. But while dogs were learning to jump from planes and bears were hauling artillery shells, intelligence agencies were developing even stranger tools for warfare. The world of espionage was about to get much more creative and much more deadly than anyone could imagine. Most people think of spies carrying briefcases and wearing fancy suits. Reality was far stranger. World War II spies packed some of the most bizarre gadgets ever created, tools that would make even modern spy movies look tame. The British Special Operations Executive became masters of deadly disguise. They turned everyday objects into weapons that could kill or cause massive destruction. A fountain pen wasn't just for writing, it contained enough explosive to blow a hole through a steel door. The mechanism was simple but brilliant. Remove the cap, twist the barrel, and you had 12 seconds to get away before the blast. But that wasn't the weirdest part. Spies carried suicide pills hidden in the most unexpected places. False teeth contained tiny glass capsules filled with cyanide. One bite down on the wrong tooth and death came within minutes. Some agents had hollow coins with poison tablets inside. Others kept lethal pills sewn into their jacket buttons or hidden behind fake fingernails. The creativity didn't stop there. British engineers developed exploding cigarettes that looked completely normal until someone lit them. The tobacco was real, the paper genuine, but hidden inside was a small charge that would detonate after 30 seconds of smoking. Imagine the shock on an enemy officer's face when his relaxing smoke suddenly blew up in his hands. Then there were the booby-trapped rats. These weren't live animals but carefully crafted fake rodents stuffed with plastic explosives. The plan was genius in its simplicity. Scatter them around German facilities, knowing that soldiers would toss them into furnaces to dispose of the dead pests. When the heat reached the explosive, boom, entire buildings could be destroyed by what looked like routine cleanup. German spies had their own bag of tricks. They developed invisible ink that could only be revealed using specific chemicals. Letters appeared blank to casual observers, but contained detailed military intelligence when properly treated. The formula was so secret that even captured agents often didn't know how their own messages would be decoded. One German invention seemed straight out of a comic book. They created explosive chocolate bars that looked delicious but packed enough punch to kill anyone who took a bite. The chocolate was real Swiss quality on the outside, but the center contained a pressure-sensitive bomb. British intelligence discovered several of these deadly treats before they could be distributed to Allied soldiers. American OSS agents received equally bizarre equipment. They carried matchboxes that weren't really matchboxes at all. Strike the fake match, and instead of flame you got a powerful signal flare that could be seen for miles. Perfect for emergency communications, when radio contact failed. The weirdest spy gadget award probably goes to the explosive coal. British saboteurs created fake coal chunks that were actually bombs in disguise. These would be mixed with real coal supplies heading to German trains and ships. When shoveled into engines and heated, they exploded with devastating force. Locomotives derailed, ships sank, and the Germans never knew what hit them. Let's not forget the deadly makeup compact. Female spies received powder cases that looked perfectly normal. Open them the wrong way though, and a hidden blade would spring out with enough force to seriously injure someone. The mirror inside could also be removed to reveal secret compartments for messages or poison. Some gadgets were designed purely for escape. Agents wore belt buckles that contained tiny saws capable of cutting through metal bars. Shoe heels held small files and lockpicks. Even buttons on military uniforms could be unscrewed to reveal compass needles or emergency fishing hooks. The Japanese developed perhaps the strangest spy weapon of all, explosive dentures. These weren't just poison pills hidden in teeth. They were full sets of fake dentures packed with enough explosives to destroy an entire room. Captured agents could take out their interrogators and themselves with one decisive bite. Many of these gadgets never worked as planned in real combat situations. The booby-trapped rats were discovered before they could do much damage. Explosive chocolate was too risky to distribute widely. Suicide pills often failed when agents needed them most desperately, but the psychological impact was enormous. German soldiers became paranoid about every ordinary object they encountered. Was that cigarette butt on the ground actually a listening device? Could the fountain pen left on the desk be a bomb? The fear of these weapons often proved more effective than the weapons themselves. Training with these gadgets required nerves of steel. One wrong move during practice could mean instant death. Agents learned to handle explosive rats like they were petting real animals. They practiced removing poison pills from false teeth without accidentally biting down on the wrong spot. The strange world of spy gadgets shows just how creative people became when their lives depended on it. While soldiers on the front lines fought with rifles and tanks, a secret war raged using weapons disguised as everyday objects. These bizarre tools changed how intelligence gathering worked forever. Speaking of creative warfare, the Germans were cooking up plans that went far beyond fancy spy gadgets. They had their sights set on attacking America itself. While European battlefields raged with tanks and bombers, Nazi Germany was secretly plotting something far more ambitious. They weren't just planning to dominate Europe, they wanted to bring the war directly to American soil. Operation Pastorius launched in June 1942 with 8 German saboteurs boarding submarines bound for the United States. The plan: land on remote beaches and wreak havoc on American infrastructure. These weren't your typical spies either. Most had actually lived in America before the war, spoke perfect English, and knew the country inside out. 4 saboteurs landed on Long Island at Amagansett Beach around midnight on June 13th. The other 4 hit Ponte Vedra Beach in Florida days later. They carried explosives, timing devices, and detailed plans to blow up aluminum factories, railroad terminals, and power plants. The Germans figured America's war production would crumble if they could strike the right targets. But here's where things get interesting. The Long Island team barely made it off the beach before running into trouble. Coast Guard seaman John Cullen was patrolling when he stumbled across the Germans burying their equipment in the sand dunes. One of the saboteurs, George Dash, panicked and tried to bribe Cullen with $260 to forget what he'd seen. Cullen took the money and walked away. Smart move, considering he was outnumbered 4-1. The moment he got back to base, he reported everything. Within hours, the FBI was swarming the beach and found buried crates packed with enough explosives to level city blocks. Meanwhile, something even stranger was happening. George Dash was having serious second thoughts about his mission. Maybe it was fear, maybe guilt, or maybe he just realized how badly this could end. Whatever the reason, he decided to betray his own team. Dash called the FBI and confessed everything. At first, agents thought it was a prank call. Who calls the FBI to turn themselves in for espionage? But when Dash walked into their Washington office with detailed Nazi plans and $84,000 in cash, they knew this was the real deal. The confession led to a massive manhunt that lasted just 2 weeks. All 8 saboteurs were captured before they could damage a single target. The Florida team had made it as far as Chicago and New York, but they were rounded up one by one. Then there's the story of what happened next, which gets even more bizarre. President Roosevelt wanted these men tried by military tribunal, not civilian courts. The legal battle over this decision went all the way to the Supreme Court in record time. The justices actually interrupted their summer recess to hear the case. 6 of the 8 saboteurs were executed in the electric chair at the District of Columbia jail. Dash and another saboteur, who cooperated, received long prison sentences instead. The entire operation took place in such secrecy that most Americans didn't learn about it until after the war ended. But Operation Pastorius wasn't Germany's only plan for North America. Nazi strategists had drawn up detailed invasion scenarios for major American cities. They studied maps of New York Harbor, calculated how many troops would be needed to hold Manhattan, and even planned bombing runs against industrial centers in the Midwest. One particularly wild scheme involved using long-range submarines to shell American coastal cities. German U-boats actually pulled this off on a smaller scale, hitting oil refineries and merchant ships along the eastern seaboard. The attacks caused more panic than damage, but they proved that America wasn't as safe as people thought. German intelligence also recruited American fascist sympathizers to gather information about defense plants and military installations. Most of these amateur spies were hopeless at their jobs. They sent reports about things like the weather and local gossip instead of useful military intelligence. The FBI's counterintelligence efforts turned into a cat-and-mouse game that played out in neighborhoods across America. Agents tracked suspicious radio transmissions, intercepted coded letters, and kept watch on German-American communities for signs of sabotage activity. What makes this whole story remarkable is how thoroughly the plans failed. German intelligence had completely underestimated American security capabilities and overestimated their own agents' competence. The saboteurs were caught so quickly that they never had time to attempt their missions. The psychological impact lasted much longer than the actual threat. Americans suddenly realized their homeland could be attacked, leading to blackout drills, coastal patrols, and widespread paranoia about enemy infiltration. Every foreign accent became suspicious. Every unexplained explosion might be sabotage. Of course, while Germans were fumbling their way through failed sabotage missions on land, other Axis powers were getting creative with their own unusual warfare tactics. The British Navy was about to discover that even something as mundane as a reindeer could end up playing a role in submarine operations, proving that World War II's strangest stories were far from over. The crew of HMS Trident thought they'd seen everything during their Arctic patrol missions. Ice storms, enemy submarines, depth charges exploding around them like underwater thunder. But nothing prepared them for their newest crew member, a reindeer named Pollyanna, who somehow managed to live underwater for 6 weeks. This wasn't some elaborate British naval experiment. It started as a diplomatic gift that went wonderfully wrong. The year was 1941, and HMS Trident had just completed a successful mission in Soviet waters. The grateful Russians wanted to show their appreciation with a traditional gift. What could be more fitting than a young reindeer? After all, these magnificent creatures represented the strength and endurance of the Russian Arctic. The problem? Nobody thought about how you transport a reindeer on a submarine. Captain Geoffrey Sladen faced a choice that probably wasn't covered in naval training: leave the gift behind and potentially offend their new allies, or figure out how to make a woodland creature comfortable in a steel tube designed for underwater warfare. The crew voted unanimously. Pollyanna was coming home with them. The reindeer adapted to submarine life with surprising ease. She munched on table scraps from the galley, developed a particular fondness for condensed milk, and seemed genuinely unbothered by the constant hum of engines and electrical systems. The captain's cabin became her personal quarters, though she had free run of the vessel when they weren't diving deep or engaging enemy targets. But here's where it gets really bizarre. During combat situations, Pollyanna would remain perfectly calm while depth charges exploded around them. Seasoned sailors would grip their stations with white knuckles, but the reindeer would simply lie down and wait for the excitement to pass. Some crew members swore she brought them luck. Others wondered if she somehow sensed danger before the humans did. The logistics were fascinating and slightly ridiculous. Submarines don't exactly come equipped with livestock facilities. The crew fashioned makeshift feeding stations and dealt with the obvious hygiene challenges of hosting a large mammal in cramped quarters. They learned that reindeer are surprisingly clean animals, but they also discovered that explaining unusual smells to visiting officers required creative storytelling. Pollyanna became the submarine's unofficial mascot, and stress relief system rolled into one furry package. Sailors would take turns brushing her coat, and she seemed to enjoy the attention. During long stretches underwater, when tensions ran high and cabin fever threatened morale, spending time with their four-legged companion provided a welcome distraction from the constant threat of enemy attack. The reindeer's presence created some unexpected operational challenges. During one particularly tense encounter with German vessels, Pollyanna decided to explore the torpedo room just as the crew prepared to fire. Picture trying to quietly move a confused reindeer away from explosive weapons while maintaining complete silence to avoid enemy detection. The torpedo room suddenly became a very delicate dance between military precision and animal wrangling. Radio communications with naval headquarters became increasingly awkward. How do you explain to command that your submarine's daily reports now include feeding schedules for livestock? The official logs from HMS Trident during this period make for entertaining reading, with formal military language describing reindeer-related incidents alongside standard combat operations. After 6 weeks of underwater adventures, HMS Trident finally returned to port in Britain. Pollyanna had survived multiple combat encounters, depth charge attacks, and the general chaos of submarine warfare. She'd traveled thousands of miles beneath the waves, probably making her the most well-traveled reindeer in naval history. The British public was fascinated when news of Pollyanna's journey eventually reached them. Here was a heartwarming story emerging from the brutal reality of naval warfare. Newspapers ran features about the submarine reindeer, and she became something of a celebrity. The Royal Navy, initially puzzled by the whole situation, eventually embraced the positive publicity. Pollyanna's post-war life was considerably quieter than her submarine service. She was relocated to a zoo where visitors could meet the famous seafaring reindeer. Handlers would regale audiences with tales of her underwater adventures, though some details were probably embellished over time. She lived peacefully for many years, no doubt dreaming of her days beneath the Arctic waves. The story reveals something touching about human nature during wartime. In the midst of deadly serious naval operations, the crew of HMS Trident found room for compassion and humor. They could have easily left Pollyanna behind, but instead they chose to accommodate their unusual passenger and make the best of an absurd situation. Naval historians still debate whether Pollyanna actually brought the submarine good luck, but the crew members who served with her never doubted it. HMS Trident completed numerous successful missions during their reindeer period, returning safely to port when many other submarines were lost to enemy action. While reindeer were making themselves at home on British submarines, entertainment was taking an equally unusual form in war zones around the world. Musicians and performers were risking everything to bring a different kind of comfort to troops fighting far from home. While Soviet pilots dropped bombs and bears carried ammunition, another kind of warrior stepped onto the battlefield, armed with nothing more dangerous than a saxophone. Music became one of the most unexpected weapons of World War II, and some of the biggest names in entertainment risked their lives to boost morale on the front lines. Bob Hope might have been cracking jokes safely in Hollywood, but he chose to travel thousands of miles into active war zones instead. The comedian performed over 200 shows for troops during the war, often within earshot of enemy gunfire. His quick wit and fearless attitude made him a legend among soldiers who hadn't laughed in months. Hope's famous one-liners about army food and incompetent officers gave troops something to smile about between battles. Then there's Glenn Miller, the bandleader whose swing music defined an entire generation. Miller could have stayed home and continued making hit records, earning millions while others fought overseas. Instead, he enlisted and formed the Army Air Force Band, taking his musicians directly to combat zones in Europe. The band played in bombed-out theaters, makeshift stages, and even airplane hangars while enemy aircraft buzzed overhead. Miller himself disappeared during a flight over the English Channel in 1944, but his music lived on in the hearts of soldiers who heard him play. Marlene Dietrich shocked Hollywood by abandoning her lucrative film career to entertain troops. The German-born actress could have sat out the war comfortably, but she despised the Nazi regime and wanted to help defeat them personally. Dietrich performed in field hospitals, singing for wounded soldiers still covered in bandages. Her haunting voice echoing through medical tents became a symbol of hope for men who weren't sure they'd survive another day. Let's not forget the classical musicians who traded concert halls for battlefields. Yehudi Menuhin, one of the world's greatest violinists, performed over 500 concerts for Allied forces. The delicate sounds of his violin created an almost surreal contrast against the backdrop of war. Soldiers who had never heard classical music before found themselves moved to tears by Menuhin's performances in bombed cathedrals and damaged opera houses. The risks these performers faced were very real. Stages collapsed during bombing raids, musicians dodged sniper fire between songs, equipment got destroyed by shrapnel, forcing bands to improvise with whatever instruments they could find. Some performers were injured or killed during attacks on the venues where they played. But perhaps the strangest musical story involves a piano that survived the London Blitz. Dame Mira Hess organized over 1,600 lunchtime concerts in the National Gallery while bombs fell on London. The gallery's paintings had been moved to safety, leaving empty walls and a single piano. Hess and other musicians performed daily concerts for Londoners seeking refuge from the chaos outside. The music continued even when windows shattered from nearby explosions. Jazz musicians faced unique challenges when entertaining troops. Many were African American performers dealing with segregated audiences and discriminatory treatment, yet they still volunteered to boost morale for soldiers who often couldn't even eat in the same mess halls. Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and other jazz legends performed for both black and white troops, sometimes breaking unofficial segregation rules through the universal language of music. The equipment problems alone could drive musicians crazy. Pianos went out of tune in extreme weather, brass instruments froze in Arctic conditions, drum sets got soaked in tropical downpours. One famous incident involved a tuba player whose instrument filled with rainwater during an outdoor concert, creating hilariously off-key sounds that had the audience laughing harder than any comedy routine. Military authorities initially resisted these musical performances, viewing them as distractions from serious warfare. But commanders quickly realized that music dramatically improved troop morale and fighting effectiveness. Soldiers who heard live entertainment showed better performance in subsequent battles. The psychological boost from familiar songs and friendly faces proved more valuable than additional ammunition in many cases. Some performances took place in absolutely bizarre locations. Musicians played on aircraft carrier decks while planes landed around them. Others performed in caves, abandoned buildings, and even partially flooded bunkers. The show always went on, regardless of circumstances. The most touching performances often happened in field hospitals. Wounded soldiers who couldn't move still tapped their fingers to familiar melodies. Music therapy wasn't officially recognized yet, but doctors noticed that patients who heard live performances recovered faster and showed fewer signs of psychological trauma. These musical warriors proved that entertainment could be just as important as weapons in maintaining fighting spirit. Their courage in traveling to dangerous locations demonstrated that victory required more than military strategy. It needed hope, laughter, and reminders of what soldiers were fighting to protect. While musicians dodged bullets to boost morale, other unusual wartime mysteries were unfolding back home. British newspaper editors had no idea they were accidentally revealing military secrets through their daily crossword puzzles, creating one of the war's most peculiar security scares. Leonard Dorr never imagined his hobby would land him in hot water with British intelligence. The 54-year-old headmaster spent his evenings crafting crossword puzzles for the Daily Telegraph, Britain's most respected newspaper. Creating clever wordplay seemed harmless enough. Then someone noticed his crosswords were predicting the future. May 1944 brought the first red flag. Dorr's puzzle included the answer, UTAA. Just another American state, right? Wrong. UTAA was the top-secret codename for one of the D-Day landing beaches. British security officers raised eyebrows but didn't panic yet. Coincidences happen. The coincidences kept happening. Omaha appeared in another puzzle. That was the second D-Day beach codename. Then came Mulberry, the classified name for the artificial harbors being built for the invasion. Intelligence officers started sweating. 3 secret code words in crossword puzzles felt like enemy action. But Dorr wasn't finished. Neptune showed up next, the naval operation codename for D-Day, then Overlord, the most classified word of all. That was the overall codename for the entire D-Day invasion. British intelligence went into full panic mode. MI5 agents surrounded Dorr's Surrey home like he was public enemy number 1. They interrogated him for hours, convinced they'd caught a German spy. How else could a schoolteacher know the most guarded secrets in the British military? The timing was too perfect. D-Day was just weeks away. Dorr protested his innocence, but the evidence looked damning. 5 ultra-secret code words appearing in national crossword puzzles couldn't be random chance. The mathematical odds were astronomical. Someone was feeding him classified information, or he was the cleverest spy in German service. The interrogation revealed something unexpected. Dorr didn't create these puzzles alone. He worked with students at his school, Strand School in Effingham. The boys helped him fill in words and suggest answers. This made the situation even more suspicious. Were German agents recruiting British schoolchildren? Then investigators discovered the truth, and it was stranger than any spy thriller. The students had been chatting with American and Canadian soldiers stationed nearby. These troops were preparing for D-Day and constantly heard the operation code words during briefings and training. The soldiers didn't realize how classified these words were. They casually mentioned Utah and Omaha while talking to local kids. The boys thought these were just interesting American words. They suggested them to Dorr for his crosswords, never knowing they were revealing state secrets. Dorr used the words because they fit his puzzle grids perfectly. Neither he nor his students understood they were broadcasting invasion plans to the entire British Empire. Military security had failed in the most ridiculous way possible. Soldiers sworn to secrecy were accidentally leaking classified information to schoolchildren. The children were innocently passing it to their headmaster. The headmaster was publishing it in Britain's most widely read newspaper. German intelligence officers probably read the Daily Telegraph every morning over their coffee. What saved Britain was German arrogance. Nazi intelligence dismissed British crosswords as meaningless entertainment. They never imagined their enemies would be stupid enough to publish invasion secrets in puzzle form. German spies looked for sophisticated codes and secret radio transmissions, not word games in newspapers. The investigation cleared Dorr completely. MI5 realized they'd stumbled onto their own security breach, not enemy espionage. The loose-lipped soldiers received stern warnings about operational security. The students learned their casual conversations had nearly compromised the war's most important operation. Dorr continued creating crosswords throughout the war, though presumably with more careful word selection. He never faced charges, and kept his job as headmaster. The story remained classified for decades after the war ended. Only in the 1980s did the full details emerge, revealing how close Britain came to accidentally advertising D-Day. The Telegraph crossword incident highlighted the strange ways information traveled during wartime. Critical secrets could leak through the most innocent channels. A child's curiosity, a teacher's creativity, and a newspaper's daily routine nearly derailed the liberation of Europe. Sometimes the biggest security threats came from pure coincidence rather than enemy action. Intelligence agencies learned valuable lessons about controlling information at every level, but they also discovered that overthinking coincidences could waste precious resources. Not every suspicious pattern indicated enemy infiltration. Sometimes weird things just happened. The crossword crisis joined other wartime mix-ups where paranoia met reality in unexpected ways. While British intelligence was interrogating innocent puzzle makers, other security disasters were brewing in the most unlikely places. Even the safest military equipment could betray its users when simple mistakes turned deadly. When most people think of underwater warfare, they picture massive submarines firing torpedoes from miles away. But what if I told you some of the war's most daring naval attacks happened with men swimming right up to enemy ships, carrying explosives like underwater delivery boys? The Italians figured out something brilliant early in the war. Why waste expensive submarines when you could send brave volunteers on what looked like metal dolphins straight into enemy harbors? These weren't your typical frogmen either. They rode machines called manieli, which literally means pigs in Italian. Not exactly the most inspiring name for a weapon, but these slow, stubby contraptions would become some of the most feared devices in the Mediterranean. Here's how crazy this gets. Two men would climb onto this torpedo-shaped vehicle, put on diving gear, and ride it like an underwater motorcycle, straight toward massive warships. The thing moved at walking speed underwater, took hours to reach targets, and offered zero protection if discovered. Makes sense, right? Well, it worked better than anyone expected. The first major success came at Alexandria Harbor in December 1941. 3 teams of Italian frogmen rode their human torpedoes into one of Britain's most heavily defended ports. They swam past patrol boats, underwater nets, and searchlights. The British had no idea what was coming. Luigi Duran della Penne and his partner Emilio Bianchi targeted the battleship HMS Valiant. They managed to attach a massive explosive charge under the ship's hull, set the timer, and try to escape. But here's where things went sideways. Their pig broke down on the way out. They got captured floating around in the harbor. The weird part is what happened next. The British interrogated them for hours, trying to find out what they'd done. These Italians just sat there, knowing their bomb was ticking away underneath one of Britain's most powerful battleships. They said nothing, even when British officers threatened them, even when they realized the explosion might kill them too, since they were being held on a nearby ship. At 6:06 a.m., the charges detonated. The Valiant's hull cracked open like an eggshell. Another team had simultaneously blown a hole in HMS Queen Elizabeth. Both battleships settled onto the harbor bottom, completely out of action for months. The British Mediterranean fleet lost half its major warships in one night, thanks to 6 Italian swimmers with homemade torpedoes. But these underwater saboteurs didn't stop there. They kept coming back like aquatic ghosts. Gibraltar became their next target. British naval intelligence started going crazy, trying to figure out how ships kept getting damaged in supposedly secure harbors. Then there's the attack on Gibraltar's harbor in September 1942. Italian frogmen swam from a secret base in Spain, crossed the heavily patrolled waters, and planted explosives on 3 ships. The British were so frustrated, they started dropping depth charges randomly around their own harbors, hoping to catch these underwater intruders. The most audacious part: some of these Italian saboteurs were getting captured, imprisoned, then escaping and doing it again. Tassio Tesse, one of the program's creators, died trying to blow up the gates of Gibraltar's harbor. He rode his human torpedo straight into the defensive boom and detonated it manually when the timer failed. What made these missions so effective wasn't just the surprise factor. The Italians had figured out that psychological warfare works underwater too. Every successful attack made the British Navy paranoid about every shadow, every unusual sound in their harbors. They started assigning hundreds of sailors to harbor patrol duties, wasting resources that could have been used elsewhere. The German Navy noticed what the Italians were doing and started their own program, but they never matched the Italian success rate. Turns out that riding explosive-laden torpedoes into enemy harbors requires a special kind of crazy that the Italians had perfected. These underwater saboteurs changed naval warfare forever. They proved that a few determined swimmers could disable massive warships that took years to build and thousands of men to operate. Harbor defense became an entirely new military science because of these aquatic daredevils. By 1943, the Allies had developed countermeasures, underwater nets, sonar detection, patrol divers of their own. The age of easy frogman attacks was ending, but the damage was done. These Italian swimmers had already rewritten the rules of naval combat. Their success inspired similar programs on both sides, leading to some of the most specialized and secretive military units of the entire war. While these underwater warriors were perfecting their deadly swimming techniques, other military planners were working on deception operations that would make the enemy see entire armies that didn't exist. When you think about military deception, rubber ducks probably aren't the first thing that comes to mind, but during World War II, inflatable tanks became some of the most important weapons the Allies never actually fired. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops took fake warfare to an art form that would make Hollywood jealous. These weren't your average soldiers carrying rifles and marching in formation. They carried paintbrushes, sound equipment, and enough hot air to inflate an entire armored division. Their job? Make the Germans believe massive Allied forces were gathering in places where barely anyone existed. The unit earned the nickname Ghost Army because they specialized in making something out of nothing. The rubber tanks looked surprisingly realistic from a distance. Made of inflatable canvas and rubber, each fake Sherman tank weighed only about 100 pounds compared to the real thing's 30 tons. Two soldiers could pick one up and move it around like a piece of furniture. But from German reconnaissance planes flying overhead, these decoys appeared identical to genuine armored divisions ready for battle. Let's not forget the attention to detail these deception experts put into their work. They didn't just plop down fake tanks and call it a day. The Ghost Army created realistic tire tracks in the mud, leading to and from their rubber vehicles. They hung fake laundry on clotheslines near the decoy camps. Soldiers even walked predetermined paths to create worn footpaths that aerial photographers would notice. Sound played a crucial role in selling the illusion. The unit's engineers recorded actual tank movements, truck engines and construction noises from real military camps. They then played these recordings through massive speakers hidden in the fake encampments. German listening posts would pick up the familiar sounds of a major military buildup happening right under their noses. The weird part is how theatrical the whole operation became. Many Ghost Army soldiers were artists, designers and creative types recruited specifically for their imagination. They approached military deception like staging a massive outdoor play where the audience consisted of enemy spies trying to kill the performers. Some even painted fake insignia and unit markings with the same care a movie set designer would use. Operation Fortitude became their masterpiece performance. Before D-Day, the Ghost Army helped convince German High Command that the main Allied invasion would hit Calais instead of Normandy. They created an entire fake army group in southeast England, complete with inflatable landing craft, dummy airfields, and phony radio chatter between fictional commanders. The fake radio communications were particularly brilliant. Operators sent hundreds of fake messages discussing supply shortages, troop movements, and tactical plans for the fictional invasion force. German codebreakers intercepted these transmissions and dutifully reported the intelligence to their superiors. Meanwhile, the real invasion preparations happened elsewhere under much tighter security. But here's where things get really interesting. The Germans fell for the deception so completely that they kept entire divisions stationed at Calais for weeks after D-Day actually began. Even while Allied forces were fighting on the Normandy beaches, German commanders still believed the main attack was coming somewhere else. They thought Normandy was just a diversion. The Ghost Army didn't stop with D-Day either. They continued their traveling magic show across Europe, always staying one step ahead of the real fighting. They'd arrive at a new location, set up their rubber circus, and convince German intelligence that major Allied forces were massing for attack. Then they'd pack up their inflatable theater and move to the next performance venue. Some of their operations bordered on comedy. During one mission, a sudden windstorm caught their inflatable tanks and sent them tumbling across the countryside like giant beach balls. Soldiers had to chase down runaway rubber Shermans before enemy observers spotted the chaos. Another time, A curious cow wandered into their fake motor pool and punctured several tanks with its horns. Then there were the close calls that weren't so funny. German artillery sometimes targeted the fake positions based on reconnaissance reports. The Ghost Army soldiers had to dive for cover while their rubber tanks got shredded by very real explosives. They were professional magicians performing in a theater where the audience could shoot back. The psychological impact extended beyond just military tactics. German soldiers began questioning their own intelligence gathering when they'd arrive at locations expecting major battles only to find empty fields dotted with deflated rubber. The uncertainty created doubt throughout German command structures about what intelligence they could actually trust. By war's end, the Ghost Army had conducted over 20 major deception operations across Europe. Their fake armies tied up real German divisions, misdirected enemy resources, and probably saved thousands of Allied lives by keeping enemy forces away from actual battle zones. While these rubber warriors were fooling enemies with inflatable tricks, other unconventional fighters were taking a completely different approach to warfare. Some combatants decided that if you're going to fight, you might as well bring some truly unusual friends along for the ride. When you think about creative military tactics, most people picture brilliant strategies or clever technology, but sometimes desperation leads to ideas that are just plain bizarre. The Soviet Union's attempt to turn cattle into living landmines ranks among the most unusual military experiments of World War II, and yes, this actually happened. The concept seemed logical enough on paper. Anti-tank mines were deadly effective against German armor, but they had one major problem: they stayed exactly where you put them. Tanks could simply avoid known minefields or follow cleared paths. But what if the mines could move? What if they could position themselves right where the enemy least expected them? Soviet military planners looked at their vast herds of cattle and saw an opportunity. Cows were everywhere on the Eastern Front. They grazed peacefully in fields that would later become battlefields. Most importantly, they were large enough to carry significant explosive payloads and naturally move toward areas where armies might advance. The training program began in 1941, during some of the darkest days of the German invasion. Soviet engineers developed special harnesses that could carry anti-tank mines on the backs of cattle. The plan was elegantly simple: train the cows to walk toward approaching tanks, then detonate the explosives at the perfect moment for maximum damage. Well, that was the theory anyway. Reality proved far more complicated than the planners imagined. Cows, it turns out, have their own ideas about where they want to go. Unlike dogs or horses, cattle can't be trained to follow complex commands or move with military precision. They're motivated by food, comfort, and their natural herding instincts, not by the strategic needs of the Red Army. The first major problem became obvious during early field tests. Cows would wander off in completely random directions, often heading away from enemy positions toward greener pastures or water sources. German tanks approaching from the east might find their bovine opponents had decided to explore a nice meadow to the west instead. Then there was the timing issue. Even when cows moved in the right general direction, getting them to position themselves at exactly the right moment proved nearly impossible. Tank battles happen fast, with vehicles moving at high speed across unpredictable terrain. Cows move at cow speed, which is considerably slower and involves frequent stops for grazing. The explosive payload created additional complications that nobody had fully considered. Carrying heavy mines affected how the cattle moved and behaved. Some animals became stressed or aggressive under the weight. Others simply refused to move at all once the harnesses were attached. A few particularly clever cows figured out how to remove the equipment by rubbing against trees or fence posts. But the most serious problem was something military planners should have anticipated. Cows are prey animals with strong survival instincts. When they heard approaching tanks, explosions, or gunfire, their natural response was to run away from the danger, not toward it. This made them worse than useless as weapons. They became mobile explosives heading directly toward friendly positions. The few field tests that were attempted produced results that would have been hilarious if they weren't so dangerous. Cattle loaded with explosives scattered in all directions once the shooting started. Some headed towards Soviet positions, forcing troops to take cover from their own weapons. Others simply froze in place, becoming stationary targets that accomplished nothing. The original landmines couldn't have done better. Soviet commanders quickly realized they had created more problems than solutions. The cattle program was quietly abandoned after just a few months, though some records suggest scattered experiments continued into 1942. Most of the animals were returned to normal farm duty, probably much to their relief. The failure highlights a broader pattern in wartime animal experiments. Both sides tried using various creatures as weapons, from anti-tank dogs to bomb-carrying bats to messenger pigeons. These projects usually failed because they ignored basic animal psychology and behavior. Animals can't be programmed like machines or motivated by patriotic duty like human soldiers. What makes the cattle mine story particularly interesting is how it reflects the desperate situation facing the Soviet Union in 1941. German forces were advancing rapidly, destroying everything in their path. Soviet military leaders were willing to try almost anything that might slow the invasion, even ideas that seemed far-fetched. This willingness to experiment with unconventional tactics would eventually pay off in other areas, though clearly not with livestock. The abandoned cattle program also demonstrates why most successful military innovations come from understanding technology and human psychology, rather than trying to force animals into unnatural roles. The Soviets would go on to develop much more effective anti-tank tactics using human crews, better weapons and smarter deployment strategies. Speaking of unconventional military tactics, some soldiers took matters into their own hands with weapons that seemed straight out of medieval times. One British officer's approach to modern warfare would make even the cattle planners seem conservative, from cows wandering through minefields to arrows flying across World War II battlefields. Yes, you heard that right. While most soldiers carried rifles and grenades, one British officer decided medieval weapons were the way to go. Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill earned the nickname Mad Jack for good reason. He charged into battle with a longbow, a Scottish broadsword and bagpipes. Not exactly your typical WW2 loadout, but Jack didn't care about typical. This wasn't some publicity stunt either. Churchill genuinely believed these ancient weapons gave him an edge in combat. His reasoning: any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. Fair enough, Jack. The man's most famous exploit happened during a raid on the Norwegian island of Vorsey in December 1941. As his unit prepared to storm the German positions, Churchill did what any sensible medieval warrior would do. He stood up, pulled back his longbow, and fired the first shot of the battle, a steel-tipped arrow that reportedly took down a German sergeant. Then there's the sword situation. Churchill's Scottish claymore wasn't just for show. During the same Norwegian raid, he used it to capture German prisoners, waving the massive blade around like something out of a Viking saga. The Germans must have thought they'd stumbled into a time warp, but the bagpipes really sealed his reputation for complete madness. Churchill would march into battle playing Scottish tunes, the haunting melodies echoing across battlefields from Norway to Yugoslavia. Imagine being a German soldier, expecting machine gun fire, and instead hearing the march of the Cameron men drifting through the smoke. His most impressive feat came during the Battle of Les Pinettes in France, 1940. Churchill single-handedly captured 42 German soldiers, using nothing but his sword and his commanding presence. How exactly do you convince 42 armed men to surrender when you're wielding a medieval weapon? Pure intimidation, apparently. The whole thing started when Churchill spotted the German position. Instead of calling for backup or planning a careful assault, he grabbed his sword and charged. The Germans were so bewildered by this sword-wielding maniac that they just gave up. Churchill marched them back to British lines like he was leading a school field trip. Later in the war, Churchill commanded a unit of British commandos in Yugoslavia. Even there, surrounded by partisans and modern warfare, he kept his medieval arsenal close. His men got used to seeing their commander stride through mountain passes with a longbow slung over his shoulder. The bagpipes served a practical purpose too, beyond psychological warfare. Churchill used them to signal his troops during complex operations. Different tunes meant different commands. It was like having a musical command center, except infinitely more dramatic. Churchill's unconventional approach actually worked surprisingly well. Enemy soldiers often hesitated when faced with this anachronistic warrior, giving his men precious seconds in firefights. There's something deeply unsettling about fighting someone who seems completely unconcerned with the rules of modern combat. His luck eventually ran out in Yugoslavia, where German forces captured him during a failed mission. Even in captivity, Churchill remained defiant. He attempted multiple escapes, once walking 150 miles before recapture. The Germans eventually transferred him to a high-security camp, but he escaped again by squeezing through a drainage tunnel. After the war ended, Churchill expressed genuine disappointment. "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years, he supposedly said. The man actually missed combat. Churchill's post-war career was equally unconventional. He became a paratrooper, learned to surf in his 60s, and worked as a male model, because apparently being a sword-wielding commando wasn't interesting enough. Military historians still debate whether Churchill's methods were brilliant or completely insane. His success rate suggests brilliance, but his approach definitely challenged every military manual ever written. Modern special forces might use night vision and advanced weaponry, but none of them can claim they conquered enemies with medieval equipment. The psychological impact of Churchill's fighting style extended beyond individual battles. Stories of the bagpipe-playing swordsman spread through German ranks, creating a legend that probably intimidated more soldiers than his actual presence ever could. Well, while Mad Jack was perfecting his medieval combat techniques, another unusual military situation was developing on the high seas. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one you're expecting. Sometimes it's something as simple as basic plumbing going horribly wrong. War has seen its fair share of friendly fire incidents, but nothing quite compares to the time a US Navy destroyer nearly torpedoed the President of the United States. Franklin D. Roosevelt was aboard the USS Iowa in November 1943, heading to the Tehran Conference to meet with Churchill and Stalin. The massive battleship was his floating White House, complete with presidential quarters and enough firepower to level a small city. Roosevelt loved naval life. He'd served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I, and considered himself something of an expert on maritime matters. The Iowa gave him a chance to see the fleet in action while traveling safely across the Atlantic. What he didn't expect was becoming the target of his own navy. The Iowa was conducting routine training exercises with its escort ships during the voyage. These weren't just for show. German U-boats still prowled the Atlantic, and the crew needed to stay sharp. The destroyer USS William D. Porter, nicknamed Willie D., was part of the protective fleet surrounding the battleship. Unfortunately, the Willie D. had already earned a reputation for mishaps and accidents. During a simulated torpedo attack, something went horribly wrong. The Willie D. was supposed to fire dummy torpedoes as part of the exercise. Instead, a live torpedo shot from the destroyer's tubes, heading straight for the Iowa. The weapon was armed and deadly, carrying enough explosive power to sink the presidential battleship. Panic erupted on the Willie D. The crew frantically tried to radio the Iowa, but they'd been maintaining radio silence as part of the exercise. Breaking that silence meant revealing their location to any listening German submarines. But with a live torpedo racing toward the President of the United States, radio protocol suddenly seemed less important than preventing an international catastrophe. The Willie D. finally broke silence with a frantic message: "Lion, Lion, come right." Lion was the Iowa's code name, and the destroyer was desperately trying to warn them about the incoming torpedo. The Iowa's crew initially thought this was part of the exercise or perhaps a German attack. Nobody suspected their own escort ship had just tried to assassinate the president. Roosevelt himself remained remarkably calm during the chaos. When Secret Service agents rushed to move him to safety, he reportedly insisted on staying on deck to watch the torpedoes approach. The man who'd guided America through the Great Depression and most of World War II wasn't about to be rattled by a rogue torpedo, even one fired by his own navy. The Iowa's captain ordered emergency evasive maneuvers. The massive battleship, despite weighing over 45,000 tons, managed to turn just enough to avoid the torpedo's path. The weapon exploded harmlessly in the ship's wake, close enough that everyone felt the concussion but far enough away to prevent damage. Roosevelt got his excitement for the day, though probably not the kind he'd been hoping for. The aftermath was swift and severe. The entire crew of the Willie D. was immediately arrested and taken into custody. They faced potential court-martial for endangering the president, even though the torpedo firing had been accidental. The incident was classified at the highest levels. Having your own navy nearly kill the president wasn't exactly good for wartime morale. Investigations revealed the torpedo had fired due to a mechanical malfunction combined with human error. During the simulated attack, a sailor had forgotten to remove the primer from the torpedo tube. When the firing mechanism activated, instead of shooting a harmless dummy, the Willie D. launched a live weapon capable of changing the course of World War II. The Willie D.'s reputation for bad luck continued throughout the war. The ship suffered more accidents, equipment failures, and mishaps than any other destroyer in the fleet. Sailors began calling assignment to the Willie D. a curse, though the crew performed their duties with dedication despite their vessel's notorious reputation. Roosevelt never publicly discussed the incident, which remained classified for decades after the war. When details finally emerged, historians realized how close America had come to losing its wartime leader to friendly fire. The president who'd survived polio, the Great Depression, and most of World War II nearly met his end thanks to a mechanical malfunction on a US destroyer. The story highlights the unpredictable nature of warfare, where the greatest threats sometimes come from unexpected sources. Roosevelt's calm reaction also demonstrated the leadership qualities that carried America through its darkest hours. While mechanical failures and human errors plagued many wartime operations, few had stakes quite this high. But speaking of unexpected wartime factors, nothing influenced military operations quite like the weather itself, which could delay invasions, sink ships and change the entire course of battles in ways no general could predict. Bad weather saved more lives in World War II than most generals ever did. A simple storm changed the entire course of history on June 5, 1944. The Allied forces were ready to launch the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted. Ships packed with over 150,000 soldiers sat in English harbors, waiting for the order to cross the Channel and hit the beaches of Normandy. But Mother Nature had other plans. The meteorologists studying weather patterns across the Atlantic delivered devastating news. A massive storm system was heading straight for the English Channel. Winds would reach dangerous speeds. Waves would tower over landing craft. Visibility would drop to nearly zero. General Eisenhower faced an impossible choice: launch the invasion into a deadly storm or postpone D-Day and risk losing the element of surprise. Here's where things get fascinating. The Germans had their own weather stations, but they'd lost most of their Atlantic monitoring posts to Allied attacks. Their meteorologists were working with incomplete data. They predicted the storm would last for days, making any invasion impossible. German commanders relaxed their guard. Rommel even left his post to visit his wife for her birthday. Field Marshal von Rundstedt sent panzer divisions away from the coast. The entire German defense network powered down, convinced no attack would come during such terrible weather. But the British had a secret weapon, a lone weather station in Ireland that the Germans didn't know existed. This station detected something remarkable. A brief window of calmer weather would open on June 6, not perfect conditions but good enough for a landing. The storm would create a gap just wide enough for the invasion fleet to squeeze through. Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist, became one of the most important men in the war. His weather predictions would determine the fate of millions. On the evening of June 4, he walked into a room full of the most powerful Allied commanders and delivered his forecast. The weather would improve slightly on June 6. It wasn't ideal, but it was their best chance. Eisenhower paced the room for 15 minutes. The weight of the decision crushed down on him. Too early and the invasion would fail in rough seas. Too late and the Germans might discover their plans. Finally he spoke the words that changed history. "Okay, let's go." The storm did exactly what Stagg predicted. German radar operators, struggling with equipment damaged by wind and rain, missed the massive invasion fleet approaching through the choppy waters. German pilots couldn't fly reconnaissance missions in the rough weather. Coastal observers, convinced no invasion would happen in such conditions, weren't paying close attention to the horizon. Then there's the irony of it all. The bad weather that nearly cancelled D-Day actually helped it succeed. German beach defenders couldn't see the approaching landing craft until the last moment. Paratroopers scattered by high winds confused German commanders about where the main attack was coming. The rough seas made German naval mines less effective, as many were torn loose by the waves. Weather played favorites throughout the war. In 1941, an early Russian winter froze German supply lines and stopped Hitler's advance on Moscow. German soldiers, equipped for a quick summer campaign, faced temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees. Their tanks wouldn't start. Their weapons jammed. Frostbite disabled more German troops than Soviet bullets did. The Battle of Britain swung on weather patterns too. Cloudy skies grounded German bomber formations on crucial days, giving RAF pilots time to rest and repair their aircraft. Clear weather helped British radar operators spot incoming attacks earlier. Rain and fog disrupted German navigation, causing bombers to miss their targets and hit empty fields instead of aircraft factories. But weather could be cruel to both sides. Allied bombing raids over Germany were delayed for weeks by cloud cover. The infamous Schweinfurt raids, targeting German ball-bearing factories, were postponed multiple times due to poor visibility. When the raids finally launched, German fighters had extra time to prepare devastating counterattacks. Japanese kamikaze pilots blessed typhoons that scattered American invasion fleets. They called these storms kamikaze, divine winds, believing the gods were protecting Japan, but the same storms that saved Japan from invasion also delayed Japanese supply convoys and wrecked their own naval operations. Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union faced weather so brutal, it killed more sailors than enemy action. Ice storms snapped steel cables. Waves tall as buildings crashed over merchant ships. Survivors floating in lifeboats faced water so cold they had minutes to live, not hours. The strangest part: both sides spent fortunes developing weather warfare. Germans experimented with artificial fog machines. Americans tested cloud seeding to create rain over enemy positions. The Soviets tried using weather stations as secret weapons, feeding false data to German meteorologists. Weather reports became classified military secrets. Meteorologists needed security clearances. Radio weather broadcasts were banned in many countries to prevent enemies from gathering atmospheric intelligence. While storms and seasons changed the course of battles, other unusual military experiments were taking place beneath the ocean's surface. The Japanese were developing some of the most daring underwater tactics the world had ever seen. Nobody talks about Japan's underwater suicide missions, but they happened. During World War II, the Japanese military developed some of the strangest submarine tactics ever attempted. We're talking about submarines so small that calling them boats might be generous. The Japanese called them midget submarines. These tiny vessels measured just 78 feet long and could barely fit 2 crew members inside. Compare that to a regular submarine, which stretched over 300 feet. The cramped space meant sailors had to practically sit on each other's laps while navigating through enemy waters. Not exactly comfortable for what would likely be their final journey. Here's where it gets wild. These miniature death traps were designed for one-way missions. The crews knew they probably wouldn't come back home. Yet volunteers lined up anyway, believing their sacrifice would bring honor to Japan and devastate American forces. The most famous attempt happened at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. 5 midget submarines launched from larger motherships positioned miles offshore. Their mission: sneak into Pearl Harbor during the main attack and torpedo American battleships from close range. The plan sounded brilliant on paper, but reality had other ideas. 4 of the 5 submarines never made it past the harbor entrance. American destroyers spotted them and opened fire immediately. The explosions turned the tiny subs into underwater coffins within minutes. One submarine actually made it inside the harbor, but got rammed by a destroyer before it could fire a single torpedo. The crew died instantly. Then there's the bizarre case of the 5th submarine. This one ran aground on a beach, and something unprecedented happened. One crew member survived and became America's first Japanese prisoner of war. His name was Kazuo Sakamaki, and he spent the rest of the war in captivity while his failed submarine became a touring exhibit across America to sell war bonds. But the Japanese didn't give up on their underwater suicide missions. They kept building more midget submarines and sending them on impossible tasks. Some targeted Sydney Harbour in Australia, others aimed for Madagascar and the Aleutian Islands. The results stayed consistently disastrous for Japan. Let's not forget the technical problems these submarines faced. The batteries died quickly, leaving crews stranded underwater in complete darkness. The navigation systems barely worked, meaning most submarines got lost before finding their targets. The torpedoes sometimes failed to launch, leaving crews with no way to complete their missions. And the weird part is how American forces initially reacted to these attacks. Many sailors didn't take the threat seriously because the submarines seemed too small to cause real damage. Some American officers joked about toy submarines until they realized how determined the Japanese crews were. The human cost tells the real story here. Hundreds of young Japanese sailors volunteered for these missions, knowing they faced almost certain death. They wrote farewell letters to their families and performed ceremonial rituals before climbing into their metal coffins. Most were barely out of their teens. What makes this even stranger is how ineffective the missions proved to be. Despite all the sacrifice and preparation, Japanese midget submarines sank very few Allied ships. The tactical impact was minimal, but the psychological effect on both sides was enormous. Americans realized Japan would use any means necessary to continue fighting, while Japanese commanders learned that courage alone couldn't overcome superior numbers and technology. Some missions ventured far from Japan's traditional operating areas. Japanese submarines appeared off the coast of California, causing panic among civilians who feared full-scale invasion. The submarines never posed a real threat to the American mainland, but their presence forced the US military to divert resources to coastal defense. The training for these missions was as dangerous as the actual combat. Japanese sailors practiced in mock-ups that simulated the cramped conditions and limited visibility they'd face in real submarines. Many trainees died during exercises when equipment malfunctioned or collisions occurred during practice runs. By 1945, Japan was so desperate that they developed even more extreme submarine tactics. They built hundreds of tiny one-man submarines called human torpedoes. These weren't really submarines at all, but guided missiles with a person inside steering toward the target. Fortunately for everyone involved, the war ended before most of these weapons could be deployed. The story of Japan's midget submarine program reveals how desperation can drive military forces to attempt the impossible. These underwater missions failed to change the war's outcome, but they showed the lengths people will go to defend their homeland. The crews displayed incredible bravery, even if their tactics were fundamentally flawed. Speaking of flawed tactics, wait until you hear about the Allies' own engineering challenges. While Japan was sending sailors on suicide missions, Allied forces were busy solving a completely different underwater problem that would determine the success of D-Day itself. When the Allies planned D-Day, they faced a massive problem that nobody talks about enough. How do you land hundreds of thousands of soldiers on beaches that have no ports? German forces had spent years fortifying every major harbor along the French coast. Capturing these ports would take months of brutal fighting. Time the Allies simply didn't have. The solution: build your own harbors, from scratch, in the middle of the English Channel, then somehow drag these massive floating docks across 60 miles of rough water to beaches under constant enemy fire. Sounds impossible, right? Well, the British had an even crazier idea for who would help build these artificial harbors. They used prisoners of war. German and Italian POWs found themselves working alongside British engineers to construct what would become known as the Mulberry Harbors. The irony was thick. Enemy soldiers were literally building the infrastructure that would help defeat their own armies. But here's the weird part. Many of these prisoners worked with genuine enthusiasm. These weren't just simple floating docks either. Each Mulberry Harbor was essentially a complete port city made from concrete, steel, and dozens of old ships. The British sank massive concrete structures called Phoenix units to create breakwaters. They positioned these giant blocks to form artificial bays that could shelter cargo ships from both German attacks and rough seas. Then there were the floating roadways. Engineers designed flexible steel bridges that could rise and fall with the tides while trucks and tanks rolled across them. Picture a highway that bends and flexes with every wave, yet somehow stays strong enough for heavy military vehicles. The prisoners helped weld thousands of steel joints and pour concrete for these floating sections. The most brilliant part involved old ships that were past their fighting days. Rather than scrap these vessels, the British filled them with concrete and sank them in precise formations. These gooseberry block ships created additional shelter for smaller landing craft. German prisoners found themselves helping to prepare ships from their own navy for this underwater graveyard. Construction happened at breakneck speed across southern England. POW camps near the coast became temporary engineering sites, where German expertise in metalwork and construction proved invaluable. Many prisoners had been engineers, welders, or construction workers before the war. Their skills were desperately needed, even if their allegiance lay elsewhere. The project's scale was staggering. Each complete Mulberry Harbour was roughly the size of Dover's port, one of Britain's busiest harbours. Building two of these monsters required more concrete than the entire British construction industry typically used in 6 months. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts mixing concrete, cutting steel, and assembling the massive floating sections. Security around these construction sites was intense. German prisoners could clearly see they were building something important for an Allied invasion, but they had no idea when or where it would be used. British guards made sure prisoners only worked on small sections at a time. Nobody got to see the complete picture. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, the first Mulberry Harbour components were already being towed across the channel. Within days of the initial landings, Allied ships were unloading supplies through artificial ports that hadn't existed a week earlier. The German defenders watched in amazement as complete harbours appeared off the beaches they were supposed to be defending. German bombers desperately tried to destroy these artificial harbours. They could see that stopping the supply flow was crucial to repelling the invasion. But the Mulberry Harbours proved remarkably resilient. Even when bombs damaged sections, repair crews quickly patched them up or brought in replacement parts. The psychological impact on German forces was devastating. They had spent years preparing to defend against attacks on existing ports. Nobody had planned for the possibility that the Allies would simply bring their own ports along. The prisoners who had helped build these harbours were now watching their former comrades lose the battle for France partly because of their own work. One Mulberry Harbour off Omaha Beach was destroyed by a severe storm just 2 weeks after D-Day. But the second harbor at Gold Beach kept operating for months, handling over 2 million tons of supplies and vehicles. Without these artificial ports, the Allied advance across France would have been impossible. The German and Italian prisoners who built these harbors had unknowingly helped seal their own country's defeat. Their engineering skills had created the supply lines that would feed the Allied march toward Berlin and Rome. Makes you wonder about the strange twists of war, doesn't it? But if artificial harbors built by enemy prisoners sounds unusual, wait until you hear about the spy balloons that kept landing in the wrong countries entirely, carrying secret messages to completely unintended recipients. During World War II, communication meant everything. One wrong message could doom an entire operation. But what happens when your secret spy tools work too well for their own good? The story of wartime spy balloons proves that even the most clever plans can spiral wildly out of control. Intelligence agencies across the world needed ways to drop messages behind enemy lines without risking human agents. The solution seemed brilliant at first. Small balloons carrying coded documents could float silently over enemy territory, dropping their cargo at predetermined locations. No pilots to shoot down, no spies to capture, just physics and wind currents doing the work. The British perfected this technique early in the war. Their balloons carried timing devices that would release message containers after calculated flight periods. Weather experts studied wind patterns for weeks, plotting the exact moment to launch these floating messengers. Everything looked perfect on paper. Then reality struck hard. Weather changes faster than any meteorologist can predict. A balloon intended for occupied France might end up in Switzerland instead. Or worse, it could drift back over friendly territory, confusing everyone about its purpose. Local farmers would discover strange metal containers in their fields, wondering if they'd found enemy bombs or Allied supplies. The Germans tried their own version of balloon espionage. Their approach was typically thorough and methodical. German engineers designed sophisticated release mechanisms that could drop multiple messages at timed intervals. One balloon could theoretically deliver intelligence to several different locations during a single flight. But German balloons faced the same problem as everyone else's. Wind doesn't follow military orders. A particularly embarrassing incident occurred in 1943, when a German spy balloon intended for Scotland ended up landing in a small English village. The balloon carried detailed maps of British coastal defences, complete with troop positions and gun placements. Local police found the intelligence cache hanging from a church steeple, where curious villagers had already gathered to stare at this unexpected visitor. British intelligence officers arrived expecting to find German secrets. Instead, they discovered their own defensive positions mapped out in remarkable detail. The Germans knew exactly where British forces were positioned, but their delivery system had just handed that same information back to the British. Talk about return to sender. American forces experimented with balloon messaging in the Pacific Theater. The vast distances between islands made traditional communication difficult, so balloons seemed like an obvious solution. Military planners calculated wind patterns across thousands of miles of ocean, confident they could predict where their messages would land. They were wrong more often than right. American spy balloons regularly overshot their intended targets by hundreds of miles. Messages meant for resistance fighters in the Philippines ended up floating over Japanese-controlled territories. Some balloons traveled so far off course that they landed in neutral countries, causing diplomatic headaches for everyone involved. The Japanese faced unique challenges with their balloon program. Their balloons had to cross enormous stretches of ocean to reach any useful targets. Most simply disappeared over the Pacific, their messages lost forever to waves and weather. The few that did reach land often arrived so damaged by salt water and storms that their contents were unreadable. Let's not forget the human element in these failures. Balloon operators had to guess not just wind direction, but wind speed at different altitudes. They needed to calculate how long their timing devices should run before releasing messages. One small miscalculation could send vital intelligence hundreds of miles in the wrong direction. Resistance groups across Europe grew frustrated with balloon deliveries. They would wait at predetermined drop zones for hours, watching empty skies. Meanwhile, their messages were probably landing in enemy territory or floating uselessly over the ocean. The very unpredictability that made balloons hard for enemies to intercept also made them unreliable for actual communication. Security became another nightmare. When balloons landed in unexpected places, anyone could find them. German farmers discovered Allied messages. British civilians found German intelligence. Neutral countries collected spy balloons from both sides, creating awkward situations for diplomats trying to maintain their neutrality. Some balloon messages caused genuine panic among civilians who couldn't tell friend from foe. A strange container dropping from the sky could mean anything in wartime. People reported possible poison gas attacks, enemy invasion attempts, or secret weapon tests. Local authorities had to investigate every balloon incident, wasting time and resources on wild goose chases. The technology itself proved frustratingly limited. Balloons could only carry small payloads, restricting message length and detail. Complex intelligence had to be condensed into brief coded notes that often lacked crucial context. Important nuances got lost in the effort to fit everything into a tiny container. Weather stations became inadvertent collectors of misdirected spy messages. Meteorologists across Europe regularly found balloon-delivered intelligence tangled in their equipment. These scientists found themselves holding military secrets they never wanted to see. Despite all these problems, balloon messaging continued throughout the war. Military planners kept hoping the next launch would work better than the last. But the fundamental problem never changed. You can't control the wind, and war waits for no weather forecast. Even the most sophisticated military technology sometimes depends on forces completely beyond human control. Most prisoners of war got captured once, maybe twice if they were unlucky. Yang Kyung-jong. This guy managed to get captured so many times that he ended up fighting for 3 different armies during World War II. Japan, the Soviet Union, and Nazi Germany all forced him to wear their uniforms at different points. His story starts in Korea, back when it was under Japanese control. In 1938, when Yang was just 18 years old, the Japanese military conscripted him into their army. He didn't have a choice. Korean men were regularly forced into Japanese service, and Yang found himself shipped off to fight against Soviet forces near the Mongolian border. During one of the fierce battles along the Kholkhin-Gul River in 1939, Yang's unit got overrun by Soviet troops. The Japanese retreated, but Yang didn't make it out. Soviet soldiers captured him along with hundreds of other Japanese and Korean fighters. Instead of sending him to a prison camp, the Soviets had a different idea. They needed more soldiers for their own battles. Yang spent the next few years wearing a Soviet uniform. The Red Army wasn't particularly gentle with former enemies, but they were practical. If you could hold a rifle and follow orders, they'd put you to work. Yang learned Russian military tactics and fought alongside Soviet forces as they defended their territory against German advances. Then came 1942, and Yang's luck ran out again. During a massive German offensive on the Eastern Front, his Soviet unit found itself surrounded near Kharkov. German forces captured thousands of Red Army soldiers, including Yang. The Germans discovered they had prisoners from various backgrounds: Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, and one very confused Korean man who'd already served 2 different armies. Nazi Germany was desperate for manpower by this point in the war. Their solution: force captured Soviet soldiers to join German units. These troops were called Osttruppen, Eastern troops. Yang became part of this reluctant army, given a German uniform and sent to defend Hitler's Atlantic Wall along the French coast. The weird part is how this all worked out. Yang didn't speak perfect German, Russian, or Japanese. Communication happened through gestures, broken phrases, and the universal language of survival. Each army that captured him basically said, "You're with us now," and handed him new gear. By June 1944, Yang found himself stationed in Normandy, manning German defensive positions along the beaches. He'd gone from fighting Soviets for Japan, to fighting Germans for the Soviet Union, to fighting Americans and British forces for Nazi Germany. The poor guy probably couldn't keep track of who he was supposed to be shooting at. When D-Day began on June 6, Yang's German unit came under intense Allied bombardment and assault. American paratroopers from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment were advancing inland when they stumbled upon something nobody expected to find in a German uniform: an Asian soldier who clearly wasn't Japanese. The Americans were baffled. Here was this guy in full German military gear, but he looked Korean. He couldn't explain his situation in English, and the American soldiers had no idea what to make of him. Intelligence officers eventually pieced together his incredible story through interpreters and lengthy questioning sessions. Yang's case became famous among Allied intelligence services because it highlighted just how desperate all sides had become for soldiers. The fact that one man could end up serving 3 different armies showed how chaotic prisoner of war policies had become. Each side was throwing captured enemies back into battle rather than properly housing them in camps. After the war ended, Yang faced another problem. Where exactly do you send someone who'd served Japan, the Soviet Union, and Germany? South Korea was establishing itself as an independent nation, But Yang's military record was complicated. He'd technically been an enemy combatant against Allied forces, even though he'd been forced into service each time. American authorities eventually decided Yang wasn't a war criminal, just an incredibly unlucky soldier who'd been captured repeatedly. They processed him as a displaced person and allowed him to return to Korea after extensive interviews. His story became part of military intelligence files that remained classified for decades. The strangest part, Yang survived all of it. 3 different armies, multiple battles across Asia and Europe, and capture after capture. Most soldiers would have been killed in any one of those situations, but Yang kept ending up in the right place at the wrong time, or maybe the wrong place at the right time. His experience wasn't entirely unique. Other Korean and Soviet prisoners ended up in German units, but Yang's triple conscription made military historians take notice. His case showed how individual stories could get lost in the massive machinery of global warfare. But Yang wasn't the only one dealing with forces beyond his control during the war. Sometimes nature itself became the ultimate commanding officer, and weather could halt Nazi attacks more effectively than any human army. Wars get decided by bullets and bombs, but sometimes Mother Nature has the final say. World War II proved that hurricanes could be deadlier enemies than any human army. German U-boats learned this lesson the hard way when Atlantic storms turned their hunting grounds into underwater graveyards. The North Atlantic became a battleground where weather mattered more than weapons. German submarine commanders thought they had the perfect strategy: hunt Allied convoys during winter months when darkness lasted longer. More time to attack, less chance of being spotted. Seemed foolproof, right? Well, those same winter months brought hurricane-force winds that could flip a surfaced U-boat like a toy boat in a bathtub. Waves reached heights of 60 feet or more. These weren't gentle ocean swells. They were moving mountains of water that could crush steel hulls and snap periscopes clean off. Captain Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock, one of Germany's most successful U-boat aces, described it perfectly. His submarine got caught in a storm that lasted 4 days straight. The crew couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and couldn't even stand upright. Half the men were throwing up constantly. The other half were too seasick to throw up. When the storm finally ended, they'd drifted 200 miles off course and used up most of their fuel just trying to stay afloat. But the real kicker: Allied convoys were sailing through these same storms completely protected. Large convoy ships could handle rough seas much better than submarines. German U-boats had to dive deep to avoid the worst waves, which meant they couldn't see anything happening on the surface. They were essentially flying blind underwater, while their targets sailed safely overhead. Then there's the strange case of U-boat Pack Rabgraf in October 1943. 12 submarines positioned perfectly to intercept a massive Allied convoy heading to Britain. The weather forecast looked good: clear skies, calm seas, perfect hunting conditions. What could go wrong? Everything, apparently. A hurricane formed out of nowhere and slammed into the area with winds exceeding 120 miles per hour. The U-boats scattered like leaves in the wind. 3 submarines suffered major damage and had to return to base immediately. 2 more lost contact with headquarters for over a week. The convoy they were supposed to attack sailed through completely untouched because the German subs were too busy fighting for survival. German naval headquarters started tracking weather patterns more carefully after incidents like this. They realized storms weren't just inconvenient, they were strategic disasters. A single hurricane could destroy weeks of careful planning and positioning. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, began calling severe weather our invisible enemy. The weird part is how storms affected different aspects of naval warfare. Surface ships could usually ride out rough weather, but aircraft couldn't fly in hurricane conditions. This meant German planes couldn't provide reconnaissance or coordinate attacks. Allied convoys became essentially invisible during major storms. German commanders knew ships were out there somewhere, but finding them in hurricane conditions was nearly impossible. Allied forces quickly figured out they could use bad weather as cover. Convoy commanders started timing departures to coincide with approaching storm systems, better to deal with rough seas than German torpedoes. Sailors got seasick, cargo shifted around, and everyone stayed miserable for days, but they stayed alive. Weather also wreaked havoc on German coastal operations. The famous Channel Dash in February 1942 succeeded partly because of terrible weather conditions. German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau escaped from French ports during a snowstorm that grounded British aircraft. but later attempts to repeat this success failed when clear weather allowed Allied planes to spot and attack German ships immediately. Hurricane damage extended beyond just military operations. German weather stations across the Atlantic got destroyed by storms, leaving U-boat commanders without accurate forecasts. They'd surface expecting calm seas and find themselves in the middle of tropical storms. Some submarines reported waves so tall they couldn't see over them, even when fully surfaced. Allied meteorologists became secret weapons in this weather war. They developed better forecasting techniques specifically to predict when storms would help or hurt convoy operations. British weather stations in Iceland and Greenland provided crucial data about approaching hurricane systems. Disinformation helped convoy planners route ships through bad weather at exactly the right times. The irony runs deeper than just tactical advantages. Germany's own weather worked against them. Baltic Sea storms damaged U-boats during training exercises. North Sea hurricanes sank supply ships trying to reach submarine bases. Even German weather was fighting for the Allies. Nature proved that sometimes the most devastating attacks come from directions nobody expects. But weather wasn't the only natural force that shaped this war. Arctic conditions created an entirely different kind of battlefield, where survival became more challenging than combat itself. The Arctic Ocean during World War II wasn't just cold, it was a frozen nightmare that could kill you in minutes if you fell overboard. Your blood would literally start to freeze before you could even scream for help. Yet, Allied sailors had to navigate these deadly waters regularly, carrying supplies to keep the Soviet Union fighting against Nazi Germany. These weren't pleasure cruises. The Arctic convoys represented one of the most dangerous missions of the entire war. Ships loaded with tanks, ammunition, and food had to travel from Britain and America to Soviet ports like Murmansk and Archangel. The route took them through some of the most hostile waters on Earth, where German U-boats lurked beneath the ice and Luftwaffe bombers waited overhead. The cold alone was enough to drive men insane. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice formed so thick on ship decks that crews had to constantly hack it away with axes, or the weight would actually sink the vessel. Sailors wore layer after layer of clothing, but it hardly mattered. The Arctic wind cut through everything like a knife made of pure winter. Then there were the German attacks. Nazi forces knew exactly how important these supply lines were to the Soviet war effort. They threw everything they had at the convoys. U-boats stalked the ships like underwater wolves, firing torpedoes into the hulls of merchant vessels loaded with precious cargo. When a ship got hit, you had maybe 3 minutes to abandon it before it disappeared beneath the black water forever. But here's the truly terrifying part about getting torpedoed in Arctic waters. The lifeboats weren't really rescue vessels, they were floating coffins. Even if you managed to get off your sinking ship, survival in those temperatures was almost impossible. Your hands would freeze to whatever you touched. Your breath would literally turn to ice crystals in your lungs. The famous convoy PQ-17 shows just how brutal these missions could get. In July 1942, 35 merchant ships left Iceland bound for the Soviet Union. German intelligence discovered the convoy and prepared a massive attack involving submarines, aircraft and surface ships. When British naval commanders realized the threat, they made a controversial decision. They ordered the convoy to scatter and the escort ships to withdraw. What happened next was a massacre. Without protection, the scattered merchant ships became easy targets for German forces. 24 of the 35 ships were sunk. Hundreds of sailors died in the freezing water. Tanks, aircraft and supplies worth millions of dollars went straight to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. The psychological pressure was just as deadly as the physical dangers. Sailors spent weeks at sea, never knowing when the next attack might come. They watched other ships explode and sink, knowing their vessel could be next. Some men cracked under the stress and had to be restrained. Others just stared at the horizon with blank eyes, their minds completely shut down from fear and exhaustion. Let's not forget the heroes who kept these convoys running despite the odds. Ship captains who stayed at their posts even as their vessels were sinking. Radio operators who transmitted distress signals until the very last second. Gunners who kept firing at German planes even when their own ship was already doomed. The weird part is how some sailors actually survived impossible situations. Take the crew of the SS Induna, torpedoed in December 1942. 13 men spent 18 days in a tiny lifeboat surrounded by ice floes. They had almost no food and barely any fresh water. By the time a Soviet ship found them, several had severe frostbite and could barely speak. But they were alive. Weather played tricks that could save lives or end them instantly. Sometimes thick fog would hide convoys from German attackers. giving the ships precious time to escape. Other times, sudden storms would scatter the vessels, making them vulnerable to submarine attacks. The Arctic was completely unpredictable, which made every voyage a deadly gamble. The numbers tell the real story of how dangerous these missions were. Between 1941 and 1945, the Allies sent over 800 merchant ships through Arctic waters to the Soviet Union. More than 100 of those ships never made it to their destination. Thousands of sailors died in water so cold it could freeze a man solid in minutes. Despite all the death and suffering, the Arctic convoys achieved their goal. They delivered over 4 million tons of supplies to the Soviet Union, including thousands of tanks, aircraft and vehicles. These supplies helped the Red Army push back German forces on the Eastern Front, eventually leading to Nazi Germany's defeat. The men who sailed those frozen seas earned their place in history through pure courage and determination. They faced death every single day for months at a time, knowing that their sacrifice might be the difference between victory and defeat. Speaking of soldiers who found themselves in impossible situations after the war ended, some Japanese fighters would discover that isolation could be even more challenging than combat itself. The war officially ended on August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, but nobody told the soldiers scattered across remote Pacific islands. These men would keep fighting a war that had already been over for years, sometimes decades. Take Hiro Onoda, a Japanese intelligence officer stationed on Lubang Island in the Philippines. His orders were crystal clear: conduct guerrilla warfare and never surrender under any circumstances. When the war ended, Onoda was still hiding in the jungle with 3 other soldiers. They heard about Japan's surrender through leaflets dropped from planes, but dismissed it as Allied propaganda. Makes sense from their perspective, right? They'd been trained to expect exactly this kind of psychological warfare. Why would they believe enemy leaflets telling them to give up? The whole thing seemed like an obvious trick. What followed was almost 30 years of isolation and paranoia. Onoda and his companions lived off the land, stealing food from local farmers and occasionally engaging in skirmishes with Filipino police. They built shelters, maintained their weapons, and waited for orders that would never come. One by one his fellow soldiers died or surrendered. By 1972, Onoda was completely alone, still convinced he was fighting for the emperor. The Philippine government sent search parties. His own family pleaded through loudspeakers. Former comrades traveled to the island to convince him the war was over. Nothing worked. Then there's the story of Shoji Yokoi, found on Guam in 1972, after hiding for 28 years. Unlike Onoda, Yokoi actually believed the war had ended around 1952, but he was too ashamed to surrender. In Japanese military culture, capture meant dishonor, worse than death. Yokoi chose to live in a cave rather than face what he saw as inevitable disgrace. His survival skills were incredible. Yokoi crafted clothes from tree bark, made tools from scrap metal, and survived on a diet of rats, eels, and whatever plants he could find. He lived in constant fear of discovery, moving his hiding spots regularly and avoiding all human contact. When American hunters finally stumbled across him, Yokoi's first words were an apology. "It is with much embarrassment that I return alive." The man had survived 3 decades in isolation and felt guilty about it. But the most extreme case might be Teruo Nakamura, a Taiwanese soldier serving in the Japanese army. He held out on Morotai Island in Indonesia until 1974, nearly 30 years after surrender. Nakamura had built an entire hidden compound, complete with cultivated gardens and sophisticated water collection systems. The weird part is how these men adapted to decades of solitude. They developed elaborate routines to maintain military discipline: daily weapon cleaning, regular patrol schedules, careful record-keeping of enemy movements. Onoda kept a detailed diary throughout his entire ordeal, documenting weather patterns and local activities, like he was still filing intelligence reports. Their dedication was absolute, but it created tragic consequences for local communities. These holdouts weren't harmless hermits. They were armed soldiers who sometimes killed civilians they mistook for enemies. Onoda's group was responsible for at least 30 deaths over the years, mostly Filipino farmers and police officers. Local governments tried everything to reach them. They broadcast personal messages from family members, dropped photographs of modern Japan, even brought in former commanders to order their surrender. The holdouts dismissed it all as elaborate enemy deception. What finally convinced Onoda wasn't evidence or family pleas. It was his former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who traveled to the Philippines in 1974, only when Taniguchi formally relieved him of duty. Did Onoda finally accept that his war was over? The homecoming was surreal. These men returned to a Japan they didn't recognize. The country had been completely rebuilt, transformed into a peaceful, prosperous democracy. Cities they remembered as ruins were now gleaming modern metropolises. Their families had aged 3 decades, while they remained frozen in time. Yet many Japanese viewed them as heroes rather than curiosities. In a rapidly changing society, these holdouts represented something that felt authentically Japanese: absolute loyalty, unwavering duty, refusal to compromise principles regardless of personal cost. Onoda became a celebrity, writing best-selling books and giving lectures about survival and dedication. Yokoi struggled more with readjustment, eventually becoming something of a recluse again. The isolation had changed them in ways that couldn't be easily reversed. Their stories reveal something profound about human psychology and military conditioning. These weren't crazy men. They were following their training exactly as intended. The same qualities that made them effective soldiers made it nearly impossible for them to accept that their service was no longer needed. While these Japanese soldiers were finally laying down their arms decades too late, other forgotten warriors were still dealing with their own delayed reckonings from the war. The conflict had created heroes and legends across every battlefield, but many of their most remarkable stories remained buried in classified files and fading memories. World War II ended officially in 1945, but the stories didn't stop there. Hidden beneath the major battles and famous victories lie countless tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. These weren't the generals or politicians making headlines. They were farmers, shopkeepers, fishermen and teenagers who stumbled into history by accident or chose courage when it mattered most. Take the French baker who saved 37 Allied airmen by hiding them in his grain cellar for 8 months. The Gestapo searched his shop weekly, never finding the trapdoor beneath flour sacks. His wife kept baking bread normally while enemy officers bought pastries just feet above hidden soldiers. When locals asked about the extra flour deliveries, he claimed business was booming. Well, it was, just not the kind anyone suspected. Then there's the Norwegian grandmother who skied across frozen mountains carrying radio parts in her knitting basket. She completed 43 trips between resistance camps, dodging German patrols while appearing to visit relatives. Her secret: she actually was visiting relatives, but also smuggling intelligence that helped coordinate Allied bombing raids. The weird part is she never learned to read the messages she carried. She memorized locations by counting trees and rocks along her route. Let's not forget the Italian fisherman who accidentally became a naval commander. When his village was bombed, he found 6 British sailors washed ashore. Instead of turning them over to occupying forces, he taught them to fish and speak Italian. For 2 years they operated as a fake fishing crew, gathering intelligence on German ship movements. They sank 3 supply boats using homemade explosives disguised as fishing nets. The fisherman received no formal military training, but his makeshift navy proved more effective than some official operations. But why did these stories remain buried for decades? Many participants never spoke about their wartime actions. They returned to normal lives, considering their contributions unremarkable. The Norwegian grandmother went back to knitting actual sweaters. The French baker continued baking bread. The Italian fisherman kept fishing, though he occasionally smiled when naval ships passed his harbor. Some tales emerged only through accident. A construction crew renovating a London basement in 1987 discovered a hidden room filled with forged documents and fake uniforms. The elderly building owner finally admitted she'd run a passport forgery operation, helping Jewish families escape to America. She'd created over 200 false identities while working her day job as a secretary. Her filing system was so organized that investigators initially thought it was official government work. And the weird part is these weren't isolated incidents. Research suggests thousands of similar operations existed across occupied Europe. A Spanish cab driver smuggled Allied pilots through Pyrenees mountain passes. A Polish librarian hid weapons inside hollowed-out books. A Dutch florist used flower deliveries to pass coded messages between resistance cells. Each thought they were alone in their efforts. Then there are the stories from the Pacific Theater that sound completely made up. An American soldier stranded on a tiny island survived by befriending a family of monkeys who brought him fruit and warned him about Japanese patrols. After 3 months, the monkeys led him to a hidden cave containing supplies left by retreating Allied forces. He later said the monkeys saved his life, though his rescue report carefully omitted these details to avoid sounding crazy. The most surprising fact about these adventures isn't their strangeness, it's their effectiveness. Amateur spies and accidental heroes often succeeded where trained operatives failed. They knew local customs, spoke regional dialects, and aroused no suspicion because they weren't acting. They genuinely were bakers, fishermen, and grandmothers who happened to be fighting a war on the side. Makes sense, right? Professional spies tried to blend in, but locals actually belonged. When German officers questioned the French baker, his nervousness seemed natural. Everyone was nervous around Gestapo agents. When patrols stopped the Norwegian grandmother, her skiing equipment and knitting supplies told a perfectly ordinary story. These people weaponized their mundane lives. Their success rate was remarkable. Intelligence estimates suggest civilian resistance networks provided 30% of actionable intelligence used by Allied forces in Western Europe. Yet most participants received no recognition until decades later, if ever. The Italian fisherman's medals arrived in 1994, delivered to his grandson, because the old man had died still believing his wartime actions were nothing special. These forgotten heroes shaped the war's outcome through countless small victories that added up to major strategic advantages. Their stories remind us that history's biggest moments often depend on ordinary people making brave choices when nobody's watching. Speaking of choices made when nobody was watching, some soldiers found themselves in situations so strange that even decades later, people struggle to believe what happened next.